The scattered Primarchs fell across the galaxy like meteors through the warp, each gestation pod carrying its precious cargo to worlds that would shape the demigods within. For the infant who would become Mortarion, fate delivered him to Barbarous, a death world where survival itself was an act of defiance against nature's cruelty. The planet existed as a monument to suffering, its surface choked by layers of poisonous fog that grew more lethal with altitude. The valleys, while still toxic enough to kill unprotected humans within hours, represented the only marginally habitable zones. Above them, the mountains disappeared into clouds of caustic vapor, where the air itself became a weapon. Barbarous had long ago fallen under the dominion of beings that had once been human, but had transcended their mortality through forbidden sorceries. These overlords ruled from fortresses built at the highest peaks, where the fog was so thick and poisonous that no ordinary human could survive for more than moments. They were necromancers and dark sorcerers who had extended their lives through rituals that corrupted their bodies and souls, transforming them into something that resembled humanity only in the most superficial ways. Their flesh had become pallid and bloated, their eyes glowed with unnatural light, and they commanded powers that bent death itself to their will. These tyrants descended periodically from their mountain strongholds to prey upon the human populations below, taking captives for their experiments and rituals, leaving terror and despair in their wake. The infant Primarch's gestation capsule came to rest not in the relatively safer valleys, but high in the mountains, in territory claimed by Thal'kyr, one of the most powerful among the overlords. Where the pod might have killed a normal infant through exposure alone, the Primarch survived, his enhanced physiology already working to adapt to the lethal environment. Thal'kyr discovered the child and recognized immediately that this was no ordinary human infant. The Overlord took the boy as his own, perhaps seeing potential in the child's obvious resilience, perhaps driven by curiosity about what this strange foundling might become. Mortarion's early years under Thal'kyr's care were marked by systematic cruelty. The Overlord raised him in the highest reaches of the mountains, where the fog was thick enough to dissolve flesh from bone and corrode metal within days. Even a Primarch's enhanced biology struggled against such conditions. Mortarion's skin became pale and corpse-like from the constant exposure to toxins, his respiratory system forced to adapt to processing air that was more poison than oxygen. Thal'kyr taught him the basics of survival in this hostile environment, but offered nothing resembling affection or kindness. The Overlord viewed his adopted son as a curiosity, a specimen to be tested and observed. The young Primarch watched as Thal'kyr and his fellow Overlords exercised their dominion over Barbarous. He witnessed the raiding parties that descended to the valleys, saw the terror in the eyes of the humans who were dragged back to the mountain fortresses, and understood the systematic oppression that kept the human population in perpetual fear. Thal'kyr made no effort to hide his nature or his activities from Mortarion. The Overlord seemed to believe that exposing the boy to such horrors would harden him, would make him accept the natural order of Barbarous, where the strong preyed upon the weak without mercy or restraint. Instead, something else took root in Mortarion's mind. As he grew and his Primarch abilities manifested more fully, he began to comprehend the full scope of the injustice that defined his world. The Overlords were not simply strong rulers maintaining order through force. They were parasites who had elevated themselves through unnatural means and used their power solely to inflict suffering on those beneath them. Every lesson Thal'kyr intended to teach about the supremacy of power became instead a lesson about the corruption of tyrants who relied on advantages they had not earned through their own strength. The breaking point came as Mortarion reached adolescence, his body now towering and powerful despite the toxins that would have killed any normal human 1,000 times over. He could no longer stomach remaining in Thal'kyr's fortress, complicit through his presence in the Overlord's atrocities. Mortarion made his choice and began his descent from the mountains. The journey down through the increasingly thick layers of poison fog would have been suicide for anyone else, but the Primarch's body had been forged in even worse conditions. He moved through clouds of vapor that stripped skin from rock, through air so caustic it left permanent scars on his pale flesh, until he finally emerged into the valleys below. The humans of the lower settlements reacted to Mortarion's arrival with understandable terror. He was a giant, standing head and shoulders above the tallest among them, his skin corpse pale and marked with chemical burns, his eyes reflecting the same kind of inhuman quality they had learned to fear in the overlords. But Mortarion did not come to prey upon them. He came seeking something he had never known in Nek'Air's fortress, kinship with those who suffered under tyranny rather than those who inflicted it. The Primarch learned to speak the local dialects, to understand the daily struggles of people who fought simply to survive in an environment that was hostile to human life. He discovered that the valley dwellers had developed their own methods of resistance, crude gas masks and protective equipment that allowed them to work in the fog for limited periods, hidden refuges where they could retreat when the overlords' raiding parties descended. These were not warriors in any conventional sense, but survivors who had learned to endure through cooperation and shared knowledge. Mortarion threw himself into this existence with absolute commitment. He worked alongside the valley dwellers, learning their techniques while sharing his own superior resistance to the toxins. His Primarch physiology continued to adapt, his lungs processing poisons that would liquefy normal human tissue, his skin developing an almost supernatural resistance to chemical burns. He could venture further into the fog than any human equipped with the best protective gear, could remain exposed for hours where others could manage only minutes. The resistance that formed around Mortarion was born from his example rather than his command. The valley dwellers saw in him proof that the overlords were not invincible, that their tyranny was not the immutable law of nature. The Primarch began organizing raids against the overlords' interests, striking at their supply lines and freeing captives before they could be dragged to the mountain fortresses. These were not grand battles, but desperate skirmishes fought in the poisonous fog, where Mortarion's ability to function in conditions that incapacitated everyone else made him a weapon of devastating effectiveness. His philosophy crystallized during these years of guerrilla warfare. Mortarion came to believe that true strength came from self-reliance, from enduring hardship through one's own power rather than through gifts or advantages granted by others. The overlords were weak precisely because they relied on their sorceries and unnatural longevity rather than their own inherent capabilities. They had made themselves dependent on powers they did not truly understand, had become slaves to the very forces they thought they commanded. In contrast, the valley dwellers survived through their own efforts, through skills and knowledge earned through hard experience. This hatred of tyrants and tyranny became the core of Mortarion's identity. He saw the overlords as the ultimate expression of oppression, beings who had elevated themselves above humanity through artificial means and used that elevation solely to inflict suffering. Every raid he led, every overlord stronghold he attacked, reinforced his conviction that such tyranny must be destroyed utterly. There could be no compromise with beings who built their power on the suffering of others, no negotiation with those who viewed ordinary humans as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The resistance grew in strength and capability under Mortarion's leadership. He trained the valley dwellers in combat, taught them to use the fog itself as a weapon against their oppressors. The overlords found their raids increasingly costly, their supply lines disrupted, their absolute dominion over Barbarous challenged for the first time in generations. Mortarion himself became a figure of legend among the human population, the pale giant who could walk through poison that melted flesh, who fought the overlords on their own terms and emerged victorious. Yet despite these successes, Mortarion understood that the resistance was fighting a defensive war. The overlords still controlled the heights, still commanded powers that could devastate the valleys if they chose to deploy their full strength. The ultimate test would come when Mortarion challenged them directly in their mountain strongholds, when he would have to venture into the highest peaks where even his enhanced physiology struggled against the lethal atmosphere. The path to true liberation for Barbarous would require confronting Nek'Air himself, the overlord who had raised him and who represented everything Mortarion had come to despise about tyranny and artificial power. Mortarion's campaign against the overlords of Barbarous evolved from desperate resistance into systematic warfare. The Primarch had spent years learning the patterns of his enemies, mapping their territories, identifying the weakest points in their dominion. Each overlord controlled a specific region of the mountains, their fortresses positioned at altitudes where the poison fog grew thick enough to kill unprotected humans within heartbeats. These tyrants had grown complacent over centuries of unchallenged rule, secure in the knowledge that their mountain strongholds were effectively impregnable to the valley dwellers below. Mortarion shattered that security through methods that reflected his core philosophy. He refused to seek shortcuts or advantages beyond what his own body and mind could provide. Where the overlords relied on sorcery and unnatural enhancements, the Primarch depended on his enhanced physiology and tactical acumen. He spent months conditioning himself to function at progressively higher altitudes, pushing his already formidable resistance to toxins beyond what should have been possible even for a Primarch. His lungs adapted to process air so caustic it could strip paint from metal. His skin developed lesions and scars that became badges of his determination rather than signs of weakness. The first Overlord stronghold fell after Mortarion identified a weakness in its defenses. The fortress sat at an altitude where the fog was dense enough to provide excellent protection, but where a narrow ravine allowed approach from an unexpected angle. Mortarion led a strike force of his most capable fighters, each equipped with the best protective gear the Resistance could manufacture. While his companions could barely function in the toxic environment, struggling to see through fogged goggles and breathe through crude filtration masks, Mortarion moved with deadly efficiency. The Overlord died before realizing the attack was underway, killed by the pale giant who had emerged from poison that should have dissolved human tissue. This victory provided a template for future assaults. Mortarion studied each Overlord's territory, learning the patterns of fog density and wind currents that determined where the toxins were thickest. He trained his forces to operate in conditions that pushed human endurance to absolute limits, accepting that casualties were inevitable, but ensuring those sacrifices achieved meaningful results. The Resistance fighters understood what they were fighting for. They had lived their entire lives under the Overlord's tyranny, had lost family members to the raids and experiments conducted in the mountain fortresses. Mortarion gave them the means to strike back effectively. The campaign gained momentum as more Overlord strongholds fell. Each victory provided the Resistance with captured equipment and intelligence about remaining targets. Mortarion proved himself not merely a powerful warrior, but a capable strategist who understood how to leverage limited resources against seemingly superior opponents. He coordinated attacks across multiple regions, forcing the Overlords to divide their attention and resources. When they attempted to retaliate against valley settlements, they found those communities had been evacuated or fortified, their populations ready to defend themselves with weapons and tactics Mortarion had taught them. The Primarch's message resonated throughout the human populations of Barbaros. He proclaimed that humanity would free itself through its own strength, without relying on outside intervention or false promises from beings claiming divine authority. The Overlords had ruled through fear and supernatural power, convincing the valley dwellers that resistance was futile against enemies who commanded forces beyond mortal comprehension. Mortarion demonstrated that such power was ultimately hollow. The Overlords bled when cut, died when their fortresses were breached, proved as vulnerable as any tyrant once their artificial advantages were negated. This philosophy became central to Mortarion's identity and would shape everything that followed. He saw the Overlords as the ultimate expression of tyranny, precisely because they had elevated themselves through means ordinary humans could never access. Their sorceries and life-extending rituals created an unbridgeable gap between rulers and ruled, a hierarchy maintained not through genuine superiority, but through advantages that had nothing to do with actual strength or capability. Mortarion believed that true liberation required humanity to stand on its own, to develop strength through hardship and adversity, rather than through gifts or enhancements granted by powers they did not understand. The Emperor's arrival on Barbaros occurred as Mortarion was planning his final assault against Thal'kyr. The Resistance had eliminated most of the other Overlords, but Thal'kyr remained the most powerful and dangerous. The Overlord who had raised Mortarion commanded his fortress from the highest peak on Barbaros, where the atmosphere was so toxic that even Mortarion had never successfully reached the summit. Thal'kyr represented the final obstacle to Barbaros's complete liberation, and the Primarch was determined to face him alone. The Emperor came to Barbaros as he had come to other worlds where his lost sons had fallen. The Master of Mankind arrived with his retinue, his presence immediately recognizable as something beyond normal human experience. Where the overlords had achieved their power through sorcery and corruption, the Emperor radiated authority that seemed woven into reality itself. He sought out Mortarion directly, finding the Primarch in one of the valley settlements that served as headquarters for the resistance. The meeting between father and son carried none of the warmth or recognition that might have characterized such reunions. The Emperor explained his purpose, speaking of the Great Crusade to unite humanity across the galaxy, of the Primarchs created to serve as generals in this grand campaign, of the legions of space marines awaiting their gene fathers. He offered Mortarion a place in this crusade, command of the 14th Legion, and the opportunity to fight tyranny across countless worlds, rather than just one death world at the edge of known space. Mortarion rejected the offer immediately. He saw in the Emperor another overlord, another being who had elevated himself above ordinary humanity through powers and enhancements that created an unbridgeable gap between ruler and ruled. The Emperor spoke of unity and liberation, but his very existence represented the same kind of tyranny Mortarion had fought against his entire life. How was the Emperor's claim to authority different from Neckheir's? Both commanded powers beyond mortal comprehension. Both demanded obedience from those beneath them. Both positioned themselves as necessary rulers over humanity rather than allowing humans to determine their own fate. The Emperor, demonstrating the pragmatism that characterized his approach to reclaiming his sons, proposed a wager. If Mortarion could slay Neckheir alone, without any assistance, then the Primarch would be free to refuse the Emperor's offer and continue ruling Barbaros according to his own principles. But if Mortarion failed, if he proved unable to complete the liberation he had promised his people, then he would accept his place in the Great Crusade and acknowledge the Emperor's authority. Mortarion accepted these terms because refusing would have meant admitting doubt about his ability to finish what he had started. The Primarch had built his entire philosophy around the principle that humanity must free itself through its own strength. He had promised the people of Barbaros that they would overthrow their oppressors without relying on outside intervention or powers beyond their understanding. Accepting the Emperor's help would invalidate everything he had fought for, would prove that his rhetoric about self-reliance was hollow. The ascent toward Neckheir's fortress tested Mortarion in ways that even his enhanced physiology struggled to endure. The Primarch had climbed these mountains before, had pushed himself to function at altitudes where the poison fog was thick enough to obscure vision beyond a few meters. But Neckheir's stronghold sat at the absolute peak, where the atmosphere became something beyond mere toxins. The air itself seemed to possess malevolent awareness, attacking exposed flesh with focused intensity. Mortarion climbed through layers of progressively lethal atmosphere. His skin, already pale and scarred from years of exposure, began developing new lesions as chemicals ate through tissue that had previously proven resistant. His lungs, capable of processing toxins that would liquefy normal human respiratory systems, struggled to extract oxygen from air that was more poison than gas. Each breath burned. Each step required conscious effort to overcome the body's instinctive desire to retreat to safer altitudes. The Primarch's determination drove him upward, even as his enhanced physiology began failing. His vision blurred as caustic vapors attacked his eyes. His muscles cramped as toxins infiltrated his bloodstream faster than his system could process them. The fortress loomed above him, visible through breaks in the fog as a dark mass against the poison sky. Neckheir waited there, secure in the knowledge that no one could reach him at such altitude, that even the adopted son he had raised in these mountains would ultimately prove unable to bridge the final distance. Mortarion collapsed within sight of his goal. His body, pushed beyond even a Primarch's extraordinary limits, simply ceased functioning. He lay on the mountainside, unable to move, his respiratory system shutting down as it could no longer process the atmosphere around him. The realization of failure was worse than the physical agony. He had promised his people liberation through their own strength. He had rejected the Emperor's offer based on his conviction that he could complete this task without outside intervention. Now he lay dying, his philosophy proven inadequate against the ultimate test. The Emperor's intervention was swift and absolute. The Master of Mankind ascended to the peak where Mortarion had fallen, moving through the lethal atmosphere as though it posed no more threat than a mild breeze. He reached Nekir's fortress and destroyed the Overlord with contemptuous ease, demonstrating the vast gulf between even the most powerful sorcerer and a being of the Emperor's magnitude. Then he descended to where Mortarion lay, lifted his son, and carried him back to survivable altitudes. Mortarion's acceptance of the Emperor's authority was born from bitter necessity rather than genuine submission. He had lost the wager according to its explicit terms. He had failed to slay Nekir alone, had proven unable to complete the liberation of Barbaras without outside intervention. The Emperor had saved his life and finished the task Mortarion had sworn to accomplish himself. The debt was undeniable, the obligation inescapable. The Primarch took command of the 14th Legion with full awareness of what this represented. He had become exactly what he had fought against on Barbaras, a leader whose authority derived from advantages ordinary humans could never possess. His genetic enhancements, his command over Space Marines who were themselves far beyond normal humanity, his position within the Emperor's Great Crusade, all of it replicated the same hierarchical structure he had despised in the Overlords. The difference was that now he was the one elevated above humanity, rather than standing among them. The resentment that took root in Mortarion during those early days would never fully heal. He had been saved when he wished to succeed or fail based solely on his own capabilities. He owed a debt to the Emperor that he had never wished to incur. Most fundamentally, his acceptance of his role as Primarch represented a compromise with his core principles, an acknowledgement that his philosophy of pure self-reliance was insufficient in a galaxy where beings like the Emperor existed. This internal contradiction would define Mortarion's character throughout the Great Crusade and ultimately contribute to his fall during the Horus Heresy, when another power offered him the means to finally escape the Emperor's shadow. The 14th Legion that Mortarion inherited bore little resemblance to the force he would eventually forge into the Death Guard. Originally designated the Dusk Raiders, these Space Marines had established their reputation during the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade through methodical warfare and disciplined assaults. Their heraldry featured red and white armor, and their tactical doctrine emphasized coordinated strikes during twilight hours when visibility favored attackers who had prepared thoroughly for their assaults. The Dusk Raiders had served with distinction under Terran commanders, earning recognition for their reliability and effectiveness in grinding campaigns where other legions might have sought glory through more spectacular means. Mortarion's first action upon assuming command was to fundamentally reshape the Legion's identity to reflect his own experiences and philosophy. The Primarch rejected the Dusk Raiders' existing practices not because they were ineffective, but because they represented a Terran military tradition he had no connection to and no interest in perpetuating. He had spent his formative years fighting a guerrilla war against overlords who commanded supernatural powers, learning that victory belonged to those who could endure conditions that broke their enemies. The Death Guard would embody this principle absolutely. The transformation began with a complete overhaul of the Legion's training regimens. Mortarion instituted practices that other legions would have considered excessive to the point of counterproductive. Space Marines were already far beyond human in their resilience, their enhanced physiology capable of surviving wounds and conditions that would kill normal soldiers instantly. The Primarch demanded more. He established training facilities on worlds with hostile atmospheres, toxic environments where even Space Marine biology struggled against constant exposure to poisons and radiation. Legionaries spent months in these conditions, their bodies forced to adapt or fail. The exposure to toxins became systematic rather than incidental. Mortarion personally oversaw the development of chemical and biological agents specifically designed to test Space Marine physiology. His experience on Barbaras had taught him that the body could adapt to almost anything given sufficient exposure and motivation. The Death Guard would breathe atmospheres that liquefied unprotected human lungs. They would fight while toxins coursed through their bloodstreams, learning to function even as poisons attacked their enhanced organs. The Primarch accepted that some aspirants would die during this conditioning, their bodies unable to achieve the adaptations he demanded. Those deaths were necessary to forge a legion capable of operating in conditions that would incapacitate any other force. The philosophical foundation underlying these practices reflected Mortarion's core beliefs about strength and self-reliance. He had rejected the Emperor's offer initially because he saw it as accepting help rather than achieving victory through his own capabilities. That same principle now shaped how he commanded his legion. The Death Guard would not rely on technological advantages or specialized equipment to survive hostile environments. Their bodies would be the weapons, hardened through exposure and suffering until they could endure anything the galaxy presented. When other legions deployed in hazardous environments wearing sealed armor and breathing filtered air, the Death Guard would fight with their helmets removed, breathing toxic atmospheres directly, demonstrating their absolute superiority over warriors who needed such protections. The Legion's appearance changed to match its new identity. Mortarion ordered the red and white heraldry of the Dusk Raiders replaced with pale gray and dirty white, colors that evoke the corpse-like pallor of Barbaros's people and the Primarch's own scarred flesh. The Death Guard's armor was deliberately left unpolished and battle-worn, accumulating the stains and damage of campaigns without the ceremonial maintenance other legions practiced. This aesthetic served a purpose beyond mere symbolism. Mortarion wanted his warriors to understand that their strength came from what they could endure rather than how they appeared. The Death Guard would be judged by their effectiveness in combat, not by parade ground standards. Tactical doctrine evolved to emphasize the grinding attrition warfare that Mortarion had learned on Barbaros. The Death Guard specialized in assaults that other legions avoided, operations where victory required advancing through killing zones that would devastate conventional forces. They deployed chemical weapons and rad bombardments to create environments where only they could operate effectively, transforming battlefields into death zones that favored defenders into nightmares, where the Death Guard advanced with implacable determination. Enemy forces found themselves facing warriors who simply would not stop, who absorbed casualties that should have broken any attack and continued pressing forward. This approach to warfare produced results that validated Mortarion's methods, even as it created friction with other Imperial forces. The Death Guard earned a reputation for accepting missions that other legions declined, for fighting in conditions that would have required extensive support assets for any other force. When compliance actions required assaulting fortress positions protected by toxic atmospheres or rad-saturated wastelands, the Death Guard deployed without the logistical complications that would have delayed other legions. They walked into environments that required other forces to bring specialized equipment and environmental suits, fighting with the same efficiency they demonstrated in standard conditions. The relationship between Mortarion and his legion developed along lines that reflected the Primarch's experiences leading the resistance on Barbaros. He commanded from the front lines rather than from stratagems aboard capital ships. The Death Guard saw their Primarch in the thickest fighting, enduring the same conditions they faced, exposed to the same toxins and hazards. This was not merely leadership by example, but a fundamental expression of Mortarion's philosophy. He refused to ask his warriors to endure anything he would not experience himself. The resentment he felt toward the Emperor for intervening on Barbaros translated into a determination never to become the kind of distant, elevated commander he associated with tyranny. First Captain Kala's Typhon emerged as Mortarion's most trusted subordinate during this period. Typhon came from the feral world of Barbaros's neighboring system, his own background marked by exposure to hostile environments, and a childhood spent surviving conditions that would have killed weaker individuals. The first captain shared Mortarion's contempt for weakness and his belief that true strength came through endurance rather than through technological advantages or genetic gifts. Typhon proved himself repeatedly in the campaigns that followed the Legion's reorganization, demonstrating both tactical acumen and the absolute resilience Mortarion demanded from his commanders. The relationship between Primarch and First Captain was built on mutual respect rather than the warmer bonds that characterized some other Legion command structures. Mortarion was not given to displays of affection or casual camaraderie. His interactions with Typhon and other senior officers focused on operational matters and the philosophical principles underlying the Death Guard's methods. The Primarch expected his commanders to understand why they fought as they did, to internalize the lessons about self-reliance and endurance that shaped every aspect of the Legion's identity. Typhon grasped these concepts completely, becoming an extension of Mortarion's will in ways that made him invaluable to the Legion's operations. The Death Guard's campaigns during the Great Crusade reflected their specialized capabilities and their Primarch's tactical preferences. They excelled in siege warfare and protracted campaigns, where other legions might have grown frustrated with the lack of rapid progress. Mortarion had learned patience during his years fighting the overlords of Barbarous, understanding that some victories required grinding down enemy resistance through systematic pressure rather than through spectacular assaults. The Death Guard applied this approach across countless compliance actions, reducing fortified positions through combinations of chemical warfare, sustained bombardment, and infantry assaults that simply would not halt regardless of casualties. The Legion's use of chemical and biological weapons became their signature, though this specialization carried implications that troubled some within the wider Imperium. Mortarion viewed such weapons as practical tools that allowed his forces to control the battlefield environment, creating conditions where the Death Guard's enhanced resilience provided decisive advantages. Other Imperial commanders saw these methods as unnecessarily brutal, noting that chemical weapons often caused suffering disproportionate to their tactical value. The Primarch dismissed such concerns as weakness, arguing that warfare was inherently brutal, and that squeamishness about particular weapon types reflected a failure to accept the realities of combat. This philosophical stance extended to how the Death Guard treated enemy populations. Mortarion had fought to liberate Barbarous from tyrants who preyed upon ordinary humans, and he retained a degree of sympathy for populations suffering under oppressive regimes. The Death Guard showed restraint when facing enemies who were themselves victims of the governments they served. However, this sympathy had limits. The Primarch had no patience for those who chose tyranny or who resisted the Imperium's compliance efforts through their own volition. Such enemies received no mercy, facing the full application of the Death Guard's arsenal without consideration for the suffering inflicted. The conditioning regimens Mortarion instituted created a legion psychologically distinct from their brother legions. The Death Guard developed a collective identity built around their ability to endure what others could not, to function in conditions that would incapacitate warriors who relied on equipment or environmental protections. This pride in their resilience sometimes manifested as contempt for forces that required such accommodations. The Death Guard viewed themselves as the ultimate expression of what Space Marines could achieve when pushed to absolute limits, and they looked down on legions that maintained what Mortarion considered excessive concern for their warriors' comfort or safety. The Primarch's command style reinforced this mentality. He demanded absolute self-sufficiency from his warriors, expecting them to solve problems through their own capabilities rather than requesting support or specialized resources. Death Guard companies operated with minimal logistics support compared to other legions, carrying what they needed and adapting to shortages through determination rather than through supply requisitions. This approach created forces capable of sustained operations in situations where other legions would have required extensive support infrastructure, but it also meant that Death Guard campaigns sometimes suffered from preventable shortages that better logistics would have avoided. Mortarion's relationship with his brother Primarchs ranged from professional cooperation to barely concealed hostility. He respected those who shared his preference for methodical warfare and his contempt for unnecessary theatrics. Primarchs like Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, who understood siege warfare and the grinding campaigns that broke enemy resistance through systematic pressure, earned Mortarion's acknowledgement, if not his friendship. Others, particularly those who emphasized glory or who commanded through charisma rather than through shared hardship, received his disdain. The Primarch saw such leadership styles as fundamentally dishonest, creating artificial distinctions between commanders and warriors rather than the unity through shared suffering he valued. The Emperor's relationship with Mortarion remained complicated by the circumstances of their first meeting. The Primarch served the Great Crusade effectively, his legion's capabilities proving invaluable in campaigns other forces struggled to prosecute. Yet the resentment borne on Barbarous never fully healed. Mortarion performed his duties with absolute competence while maintaining emotional distance from the Emperor and the wider Imperial project. He fought because he had accepted the terms of their wager, and because the Great Crusade's stated goal of liberating humanity from tyrants aligned with his own values. The fact that this service also perpetuated a hierarchy he philosophically opposed created a tension that defined his character throughout this period. The Death Guard under Mortarion became specialists in warfare that other legions avoided, accepting missions in toxic environments and protracted sieges, where their unique conditioning provided decisive advantages. Their reputation grew as forces that could be deployed into any environment regardless of hazards, that would advance through killing zones that should have stopped any assault, that measured success through enemy destruction rather than through minimizing their own casualties. This effectiveness came at a cost in terms of the Legion's relationships with other Imperial forces, and in the psychological toll of constant exposure to the most brutal forms of warfare the Great Crusade produced. The Death Guard's deployment patterns during the Great Crusade reflected their Primarch's methodical approach to warfare and the specialized capabilities Mortarion had cultivated within the Legion. While other legions sought glory through rapid conquests or spectacular victories, the 14th Legion found itself assigned to compliance actions that required sustained effort in hostile environments. The Administratum and the War Master's strategic planning apparatus recognized what the Death Guard could accomplish in situations where other forces would struggle, and the Legion's campaign assignments reflected this understanding. They deployed to worlds where toxic atmospheres made standard operations difficult, to sieges that demanded grinding attrition rather than swift assault, and to wars against enemies who had fortified their positions so thoroughly that only systematic reduction would achieve victory. The compliance of Gallispar demonstrated the Death Guard's tactical doctrine in its purest form. The world's human population had regressed to a feudal technological level, but retained control of extensive underground fortress complexes built during the Dark Age of technology. These installations featured sealed environments protected by automated defense systems that had continued functioning for millennia. The local warlords who controlled these fortresses had no interest in imperial compliance, viewing the Imperium as simply another threat to their independence. Previous Imperial army forces had attempted to negotiate or to assault the fortress entrances directly, achieving nothing except casualties against defense systems designed to repel exactly such attacks. Mortarion approached the problem with characteristic pragmatism. The Death Guard deployed chemical weapons into the fortress ventilation systems, introducing toxins that bypassed the automated defenses entirely. The fortress populations found themselves breathing air that grew progressively more lethal as the Death Guard maintained their chemical bombardment for weeks. When defenders attempted to seal ventilation systems, the Legion simply waited, understanding that sealed fortresses would eventually face resource depletion. The Gallispar warlords surrendered after 3 months of siege, their populations suffering from the effects of prolonged exposure to toxins that the Death Guard had calibrated to cause maximum discomfort without quite reaching lethal concentrations. Other Imperial forces might have viewed such methods as excessive, but Mortarion considered them efficient. The fortresses had fallen with minimal Death Guard casualties, and without requiring the extensive orbital bombardment that would have destroyed the infrastructure the Imperium wanted to preserve. The campaign against the Jorgal demonstrated the Legion's capabilities against Xenos threats in environments that favored the aliens' biology. The Jorgal were a species that had evolved in high radiation environments, their physiology naturally resistant to levels of radioactivity that would kill unprotected humans within hours. They had established colonies across multiple worlds in a region of space where stellar activity produced constant radiation storms. Previous Imperial compliance efforts had required extensive shielding and rad-hardened equipment, slowing operations to the point where the Jorgal could respond effectively to Imperial advances. The Death Guard's enhanced resistance to radiation and their Primarch's systematic conditioning allowed them to operate in these environments with far less logistical support than other forces required. Mortarion's approach to the Jorgal campaign involved deliberate escalation of environmental hazards. The Death Guard deployed rad weapons that increased background radiation to levels that even the Jorgal found challenging, transforming their natural advantage into a neutral factor. The Legion then pressed attacks through terrain where radiation levels fluctuated wildly, their own resilience allowing them to advance through zones where both sides suffered from exposure, but where the Death Guard's training gave them superior ability to function while affected. The Jorgal discovered that their environmental advantages meant nothing against enemies who had been systematically prepared to fight in conditions that exceeded what the Xenos naturally tolerated. The campaign lasted 2 years and resulted in the complete extermination of Jorgal colonies across 17 worlds, with the Death Guard accepting casualty rates that other legions would have considered unsustainable, but which Mortarion viewed as acceptable costs for total victory. The Siege of Ibsen represented the kind of protracted operation where the Death Guard's philosophy of endurance through suffering proved decisive. The world's population had developed during the Age of Strife into a militarized society that maintained Dark Age technology, including void shields and plasma weapons. Their capital city was protected by overlapping defensive systems that made direct assault prohibitively expensive. The Ibsen government rejected all offers of compliance, their leadership convinced that their fortifications made them invulnerable to Imperial conquest. The Death Guard deployed to Ibsen after an Imperial army siege had stalled for 8 months, the conventional forces unable to breach the defenses without unacceptable losses. Mortarion established siege lines that completely encircled the capital city and began systematic bombardment with conventional weapons mixed with chemical agents. The Death Guard made no immediate attempt to breach the defenses, instead focusing on degrading them through sustained fire and preventing any resupply of the besieged population. When Ibsen forces attempted sorties to break the siege lines, they encountered Death Guard positions that simply absorbed the attacks and continued their methodical reduction of the city's defenses. The siege lasted 14 months, with the Death Guard rotating companies through the siege lines to maintain constant pressure, while other elements of the Legion conducted operations elsewhere on Ibsen. The capital finally fell when its void shields failed due to accumulated damage and power depletion, allowing the Death Guard to advance into a city whose population had been weakened by months of exposure to the chemical agents that had seeped through even sealed environments. These campaigns established patterns that repeated across hundreds of compliance actions. The Death Guard excelled in situations where victory required patience and the willingness to accept casualties that would have caused other forces to request reinforcement or to alter their tactical approach. Mortarion commanded his legion with the same philosophy he had developed on Barbaros, viewing each campaign as a test of endurance, where success belonged to those who could outlast their enemies regardless of the costs involved. The Primarch personally led many of these operations, his presence on the front lines reinforcing the Death Guard's identity as warriors who shared their commanders, suffering rather than serving a distant authority. The relationships Mortarion developed with his brother Primarchs during this period reflected his fundamental distrust of authority and his contempt for what he perceived as weakness or hypocrisy. His interactions with Magnus, the Red of the Thousand Suns, proved particularly contentious, rooted in philosophical differences that went beyond simple personality conflicts. Magnus embodied everything Mortarion had learned to hate during his youth on Barbaros. The Crimson King was a psyker of immense power who openly practiced sorcery and who advocated for the Imperium to embrace psychic abilities rather than suppress them. Mortarion saw Magnus as fundamentally similar to the overlords of Barbaros, a being who had elevated himself through powers that ordinary humans could never access, and who used those powers to position himself above humanity rather than among it. The Primarch of the Death Guard made no effort to hide his contempt for Magnus or for the Thousand Sons practices. He viewed all Psykers with suspicion that bordered on hatred, seeing their abilities as corrupting influences that created artificial hierarchies. The Emperor's use of Psykers throughout the Imperium represented a hypocrisy that Mortarion found particularly galling. The imperial truth proclaimed that there were no gods and that humanity must rely on reason and science rather than superstition. Yet the Imperium employed Psykers, whose abilities seemed indistinguishable from the sorcery that the overlords of Barbaros had wielded. When Magnus argued that psychic powers were simply another aspect of human evolution that should be studied and mastered, Mortarion responded that such powers were inherently corrupting, and that their use inevitably led to the kind of tyranny he had fought against his entire life. These philosophical disputes occasionally escalated beyond mere debate. During a strategic planning session for a joint operation, Mortarion refused to coordinate with Thousand Sons forces, arguing that he would not risk his legion's effectiveness by relying on sorcery that might fail or turn against Imperial forces. Magnus accused Mortarion of allowing personal prejudices to compromise military effectiveness, noting that the Death Guard's specialized capabilities were themselves a form of advantage that ordinary humans could never access. The Primarch of the Death Guard responded that his legion's abilities came from training and physical conditioning rather than from unexplained powers, a distinction that Magnus dismissed as semantic rather than substantive. The joint operation proceeded with minimal coordination between the two legions, each Primarch commanding his forces independently rather than attempting to integrate their efforts. Mortarion's relationship with Horus Lupercal proved more complex, shaped by the War Master's political acumen and his ability to work effectively with Primarchs whose personalities differed vastly from his own. Horus recognized Mortarion's capabilities and the Death Guard's value in the kinds of campaigns that other legions found frustrating or inglorious. The War Master made efforts to include Mortarion in strategic planning and to acknowledge the 14th Legion's contributions to the Great Crusade's progress. This recognition mattered to Mortarion more than he typically admitted, providing validation that his methods and his Legion's sacrifices served meaningful purposes within the wider Imperial project. However, Mortarion never fully trusted Horus in the way that some other Primarchs did. The War Master's charisma and his talent for inspiring loyalty struck Mortarion as manipulative rather than genuine. He saw in Horus another form of the elevated authority he instinctively distrusted, a commander who led through force of personality rather than through shared hardship. When Horus organized gatherings of Primarchs for strategic discussions or simply for fellowship, Mortarion typically attended out of duty rather than genuine interest in socializing with his brothers. He contributed to tactical planning when his expertise was relevant, but avoided the informal interactions that other Primarchs seemed to value. The Death Guard's reputation across the wider Imperium grew during this period into something that inspired both respect and unease. Imperial army commanders recognized that the 14th Legion could accomplish objectives that other forces struggled with, but they also understood that campaigns involving the Death Guard typically featured brutal conditions and high casualties. The Legion's willingness to accept losses that would have been considered catastrophic for other units made them invaluable for specific operations, while also making them difficult to integrate into combined arms campaigns, where other Imperial forces expected more conventional approaches to casualty management. This reputation extended to how other Space Marine legions viewed the Death Guard. Some legions, particularly those that emphasized glory or martial honor, considered Mortarion's forces to be grim and joyless warriors who reduced warfare to mere arithmetic of attrition. The Death Guard accepted such characterizations with indifference, viewing criticism from legions that prioritized appearance or reputation over effectiveness as validation of their own superiority. Other legions that shared the Death Guard's preference for methodical warfare developed better working relationships, recognizing common ground in tactical doctrine even when philosophical differences remained. Mortarion's growing disillusionment with the Emperor's vision developed gradually rather than through any single revelation. The Primarch had accepted his role in the Great Crusade, with reservations rooted in the circumstances of his first meeting with the Emperor, and those reservations never fully resolved. As the Crusade progressed and Mortarion witnessed how the Imperium actually functioned rather than how it was described in official rhetoric, his doubts intensified. The Emperor proclaimed the imperial truth and the supremacy of reason over superstition, yet the Imperium relied extensively on psychers whose abilities seemed indistinguishable from sorcery. The Great Crusade claimed to liberate humanity from tyrants and Xenos threats, yet it imposed imperial authority through force and offered populations no choice about joining the Imperium. The Primarch saw these contradictions as evidence that the Emperor was simply another tyrant, more powerful and more sophisticated than the overlords of Barbaros, but ultimately no different in substance. The Imperium created the same kind of hierarchical structure that Mortarion had fought against, with the Emperor and his Primarchs elevated far above ordinary humanity through advantages that regular humans could never access. The fact that these advantages came from genetic engineering rather than from sorcery seemed like a distinction without meaningful difference. Both created unbridgeable gaps between rulers and ruled. Both positioned certain individuals as inherently superior and therefore justified in commanding others. This philosophical disillusionment remained largely internal during the Great Crusade's earlier decades. Mortarion continued performing his duties with absolute competence, his legion achieving objectives and expanding imperial territory across hundreds of worlds. However, the resentment that had taken root on Barbaros continued growing, fed by every instance where the Emperor's actions seemed to contradict his stated principles. The Primarch of the Death Guard served the Imperium while increasingly doubting whether the Imperium truly represented anything better than the tyrannies it replaced, a tension that would eventually make him vulnerable to alternatives that promised liberation from the Emperor's authority, regardless of what such liberation might actually cost. The transformation of Mortarion from loyal Primarch to traitor did not occur through a single moment of corruption, but through the systematic exploitation of resentments that had festered since his first meeting with the Emperor. First Captain Kala's Typhon understood his Primarch's nature better than most, having served alongside Mortarion for decades, and observed how the master of the Death Guard viewed authority and power. Typhon had his own reasons for harboring doubts about the Imperial project, his background on a world that had maintained its own traditions and beliefs, making him receptive to alternatives to the Emperor's vision. What Mortarion did not know was that his first captain had already been touched by forces from beyond the material realm, that Typhon had made contact with entities that promised power beyond what the Emperor offered and freedom from the constraints of Imperial service. The corruption of Typhon had begun subtly, through dreams and visions that seemed to offer insights rather than obvious temptations. The beings that reached out to him through the warp did not present themselves as demons or gods, but as sources of knowledge that the Emperor had deliberately withheld from his servants. They whispered of the true nature of the warp, of powers that could grant genuine immortality and strength that did not depend on the Emperor's genetic manipulations. Typhon listened to these whispers with growing interest, his own ambitions and his resentment of the limitations placed on him, making him vulnerable to promises of advancement beyond what Imperial service could provide. The entity that claimed him was Nurgle, the chaos god whose domain encompassed decay and endurance, disease, and resilience. The plague god recognized in the Death Guard a legion already predisposed toward his sphere of influence, warriors who had been conditioned to endure suffering and who took pride in their ability to function in conditions that would destroy others. Typhon began working on Mortarion with calculated patience, never directly advocating for rebellion, but instead reinforcing the Primarch's existing doubts about the Emperor and the Imperium. The first captain would raise questions during private discussions about the contradictions between the Imperial truth and the Imperium's actual practices. He pointed out instances where the Emperor's actions seemed to contradict his stated principles, where the rhetoric of liberation and enlightenment masked what was ultimately conquest and forced compliance. These observations were not fabrications, but careful selections of genuine issues that Typhon knew would resonate with Mortarion's philosophical concerns. The Primarch had seen these contradictions himself, but had generally kept his doubts private, unwilling to voice criticisms that might be interpreted as disloyalty. Typhon gave him permission to acknowledge what he already believed, validating concerns that Mortarion had been suppressing. The first captain was particularly effective at exploiting Mortarion's hatred of Psykers, and his view that the Emperor's use of such individuals represented fundamental hypocrisy. Typhon would mention incidents where Psykers had caused problems during campaigns, where their abilities had proven unreliable or had produced unintended consequences. He drew connections between the Emperor's tolerance of Psykers and the sorcery that the overlords of Barbarous had wielded, suggesting that the distinction between sanctioned Psykers and forbidden sorcerers was arbitrary rather than meaningful. When the Council of Nicaea convened to address the question of how the legions should handle Psykers within their ranks, Typhon encouraged Mortarion to speak forcefully against Magnus and the Thousand Sons, knowing that the Primarch's testimony would carry weight given his well-known opposition to psychic practices. Mortarion's participation in the Council of Nicaea represented one of his most public criticisms of imperial policy and of his brother Primarchs. He argued before the Emperor and the assembled Primarchs that Psykers represented an inherent danger to the Imperium, that their powers came from sources that could not be fully controlled or understood, and that relying on such abilities inevitably led to corruption and tyranny. The Primarch of the Death Guard cited his experiences on Barbarous, describing how the overlords had used sorcery to elevate themselves above humanity and to maintain their oppressive rule. He contended that imperial Psykers were following the same path, using powers that ordinary humans could never access to position themselves as necessary intermediaries between humanity and forces that should not be engaged with at all. Magnus responded to these accusations with his own arguments about the nature of psychic abilities and the necessity of understanding the warp rather than simply fearing it. The debate between the two Primarchs became heated, with Mortarion accusing Magnus of arrogance and willful blindness to the dangers of the powers he wielded, while Magnus characterized Mortarion as superstitious and unwilling to accept aspects of reality that made him uncomfortable. The Emperor's final ruling sided partially with Mortarion's position, restricting the use of psychic powers within the legions and disbanding the librarious programs that had been training Space Marine Psykers. This decision validated Mortarion's concerns in official terms, though it also created resentment among those Primarchs who had advocated for a more permissive approach to psychic abilities. Typhon used the aftermath of Nicaea to further reinforce Mortarion's sense that the Emperor's authority was arbitrary and inconsistent. The first captain pointed out that while the Emperor had restricted Legion Psykers, he continued employing Psykers extensively throughout the wider Imperium and maintained his own psychic abilities without apparent limitation. The ruling seemed designed to control the Primarchs and their legions, rather than to address the genuine dangers that Mortarion had identified. This interpretation fed into the Primarch's existing belief that the Emperor was simply another tyrant who used rules and restrictions to maintain his dominance rather than to serve any principled purpose. When Horus began his rebellion against the Emperor, Typhon was among the first to recognize the opportunity this presented. The War Master's decision to reject imperial authority and to fight for independence from Terra offered exactly what Mortarion had always wanted, a chance to escape the Emperor's control and to prove that the Imperium's hierarchy was not immutable. Typhon brought word of Horus's intentions to Mortarion carefully, framing the rebellion not as simple treachery, but as a justified response to the Emperor's tyranny and hypocrisy. The first captain emphasized that Horus was fighting for the same principles that Mortarion had championed on Barbarous, the right of humanity to determine its own fate rather than submitting to a distant authority that claimed to know what was best for everyone. Mortarion's decision to join Horus did not come immediately or without deliberation. The Primarch understood that rebellion against the Emperor meant civil war, that it would pit the legions against each other and result in Space Marines killing their brothers. However, the opportunity to finally act on his long-suppressed resentments proved too compelling to resist. Horus offered Mortarion what the Emperor never had: acknowledgement that the imperial system was flawed and that the Primarchs had legitimate grievances against their creator. The War Master did not demand blind loyalty, but instead appealed to Mortarion's sense of justice and his hatred of tyranny, arguing that the Emperor had become exactly the kind of oppressor that the Great Crusade claimed to fight against. The Primarch of the Death Guard committed his legion to Horus's cause with full awareness that this decision represented a point of no return. He gathered his senior commanders and explained his reasoning, laying out the case against the Emperor and the Imperium in terms that reflected years of accumulated grievances. Mortarion told his warriors that they would be fighting for genuine liberation rather than simply exchanging one master for another, that Horus's rebellion represented humanity's best chance to escape from the tyranny of a being who had positioned himself as humanity's absolute ruler. Most of the Death Guard accepted their Primarch's decision without significant resistance, their loyalty to Mortarion outweighing whatever attachment they felt to the wider Imperial project. However, not all Death Guard Space Marines agreed with Mortarion's choice. Elements within the Legion remained loyal to the Emperor, viewing their oaths to Terra as binding regardless of their Primarch's decision. These loyalists represented a minority within the 14th Legion, but a significant enough faction that they posed a potential threat to Mortarion's plans. The Primarch faced a decision that would define the character of his rebellion: how to handle warriors who refused to follow him into treason against the Emperor they had sworn to serve. The solution came in the form of the Istvan III operation, a plan coordinated among the traitor legions to eliminate their loyalist elements before those warriors could warn Terra or organize effective resistance. The target was Istvan III, a world that had recently rejected imperial authority and declared independence. The official mission was a standard compliance action to bring the world back into the Imperium by force, but the actual purpose was far darker. The traitor Primarchs would deploy their loyalist elements to the surface under the pretense of a normal military operation, then eliminate them through orbital bombardment with virus weapons and direct assault by forces they trusted. Mortarion participated in this atrocity with cold calculation rather than enthusiasm or reluctance. He identified the Death Guard companies and individual warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor seemed likely to override their loyalty to him personally. These forces received deployment orders to Istvan III's surface, assigned to assault positions that would place them in specific zones when the betrayal occurred. The Primarch did not deceive himself about what he was ordering. These were his own gene sons, warriors he had trained and led through countless campaigns, Space Marines who had proven their worth in the grinding warfare that defined the Death Guard's operations. Their only crime was maintaining loyalty to oaths they had sworn before Mortarion decided to rebel. The virus bombing of Istvan III represented warfare at its most absolute and merciless. The traitor fleets in orbit deployed Life-Eater virus weapons across the planet's surface, releasing biological agents that consumed all organic matter they contacted. The virus spread with terrifying speed, killing not only the loyalist Space Marines on the surface, but also the entire planetary population. Flesh liquefied and reformed into flammable gases that ignited in firestorms hot enough to crack ferrocrete and melt metal. The loyalists who survived the initial virus deployment found themselves fighting for survival in a hellscape where the atmosphere itself had become lethal, where their own dead brothers' bodies had been transformed into fuel for flames that swept across continents. The Death Guard loyalists on Istvan III responded to the betrayal with the same grim determination that characterized their legion. They organized defensive positions in the ruins of cities that had been transformed into charnel houses, using whatever equipment and supplies had survived the virus bombing. These warriors understood that they had been marked for death by their own Primarch, and that survival meant holding out long enough to somehow get word to Terra about what had occurred. The fact that Mortarion had betrayed them seemed to hurt worse than the physical wounds they suffered, representing a fundamental violation of the bonds that were supposed to exist between a Primarch and his legion. Mortarion deployed additional Death Guard forces to the surface to finish what the virus bombing had started, sending warriors he trusted to eliminate the survivors through direct combat. These assault forces found themselves fighting brothers who knew their tactics and capabilities intimately, who had trained alongside them, and who understood Death Guard doctrine as well as they did. The battles on Istvan III's surface became vicious close quarters fighting where familiarity bred brutality rather than hesitation. The traitor Death Guard had accepted that their loyalist brothers were enemies who needed to be destroyed, while the loyalists fought with the desperation of warriors who knew they were already dead, but wanted to take as many traitors with them as possible. The siege of Istvan III lasted months longer than the traitor Primarchs had anticipated, the loyalist survivors proving far more difficult to eliminate than expected. The Death Guard loyalists established strongholds in the ruins and conducted raids against traitor positions, using their knowledge of Legion tactics to maximize the damage they could inflict. Mortarion observed these operations from orbit with mixed emotions. He recognized the courage and skill his former sons displayed in their hopeless resistance, qualities he had cultivated in them through years of training and shared campaigns. However, he had made his choice and would not allow sentiment to compromise the rebellion's success. The loyalists had to die because their survival represented a threat to everything he was fighting for. The Istvan V operation followed once the situation on Istvan III had been contained sufficiently that the traitor legions could turn their attention to the next phase of Horus's plan. The War Master had anticipated that the Emperor would respond to the Istvan III atrocity by sending forces to punish those responsible and to bring the traitor legions back into compliance. The response came in the form of 7 legions dispatched to Istvan V, where intelligence indicated the traitors had established their primary base of operations. What the loyalist Primarchs did not know was that 4 of the 7 legions sent to punish the traitors were themselves secretly aligned with Horus, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true allegiances. The Death Guard deployed to Istvan V as part of the traitor force that would spring the trap. Mortarion positioned his legion in prepared defensive positions, fortifications that had been constructed specifically to channel the loyalist assault into killing zones, where the traitors could bring maximum firepower to bear. The Primarch had fought enough sieges to understand how to create defensive positions that would bleed attackers while preserving his own forces, and he applied that expertise to preparing for what would become the drop site massacre. The initial loyalist assault proceeded as Horus had anticipated. 3 legions made combat drops onto Istvan V's surface, their Primarchs leading from the front in what they believed was a righteous mission to punish traitors and restore imperial authority. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands deployed with the confidence of warriors who believed they held numerical and moral superiority over enemies who had already demonstrated their treachery at Istvan III. The landing zones came under immediate fire from traitor positions, but the Loyalists pressed their assault with determination, establishing beachheads and beginning their advance toward the traitor fortifications. The Death Guard engaged the advancing Loyalists with the same methodical approach they applied to all combat operations. Mortarion's forces occupied positions that forced the attackers to advance through terrain the traitors had prepared specifically for defense, using pre-positioned obstacles and fire lanes to maximize casualties among the Loyalist forces. The fighting was brutal and direct, Space Marines killing Space Marines in combat that lacked any of the glory or honor that the legions typically associated with warfare. This was simple slaughter dressed in the forms of military operations, brothers murdering brothers because their Primarchs had chosen different sides in a rebellion that would tear the Imperium apart. The trap closed when the 4 supposedly loyalist legions that had deployed as the second wave revealed their true allegiances. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion turned on their supposed allies, opening fire on the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands from positions that should have been providing support. The Loyalists found themselves caught between the original traitor forces they had been assaulting and the betrayers in their rear, subjected to crossfire from enemies who knew their dispositions and capabilities because they had coordinated the operation together. The Death Guard pressed their assault against loyalists who were now fighting desperately for survival rather than prosecuting an offensive operation. Mortarion led elements of his legion personally, his massive frame visible through the smoke and fire as he cut down warriors who had been his allies mere hours before. The Primarch felt no satisfaction in this slaughter, but neither did he feel significant remorse. These loyalists had chosen to serve the Emperor, had maintained their allegiance to a tyrant who Mortarion believed deserved to be overthrown. Their deaths were necessary casualties in a war that would determine whether humanity remained enslaved to the Emperor's vision or could forge a different future. The massacre continued for hours as the traitor legions systematically destroyed the 3 loyalist forces that had walked into their trap. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands suffered catastrophic casualties, their legions broken as effective fighting forces, even though scattered survivors managed to escape the killing field. The Iron Hands lost their Primarch Ferrus Manus, killed by Fulgrim in single combat that demonstrated how completely the traitor Primarchs had committed to their rebellion. The death of a Primarch at the hands of another Primarch represented a line crossed that could never be uncrossed, proof that the civil war would be prosecuted without mercy or restraint. Mortarion observed the aftermath of the drop site massacre with the understanding that he had fully committed himself and his legion to damnation by imperial standards. The Death Guard had participated in the murder of thousands of loyalist space marines, had helped execute a plan that relied on betrayal and deception rather than honest combat. There would be no reconciliation with the Emperor now, no possibility of claiming the rebellion had been a misunderstanding or a temporary lapse in judgment. The Death Guard were traitors by any definition, warriors who had turned on their brothers and helped orchestrate one of the most devastating defeats the Space Marine legions had ever suffered. The Primarch had achieved what he wanted: open rebellion against the Emperor and commitment to a cause that promised liberation from imperial tyranny. However, the methods required to reach this point had already begun transforming both Mortarion and his legion in ways that would have horrified the warrior who had fought to free Barbarus from its overlords. The Death Guard had become the kind of force that relied on treachery and mass murder to achieve its objectives, that killed without honor or restraint because their cause justified any action. Mortarion told himself that these were necessary evils required to overthrow a tyrant, that the Emperor's defeat would justify the means used to achieve it. What he did not yet understand was that Typhon's whispers had been preparing him for an even greater betrayal, one that would cost him and his legion far more than their loyalty to the Imperium. The Death Guard departed from the Istvan system, with their fleet intact and their legion committed fully to Horus's rebellion. Their orders directed them toward Terra itself, as part of the War Master's strategy to strike at the Emperor before loyalist forces could consolidate their defenses. The journey would take the Death Guard through the warp, that realm of impossible physics and nightmarish entities that existed beneath reality's surface. Space Marine vessels had made such journeys countless times during the Great Crusade, their navigators guiding them through the warp's currents, while Gellar fields maintained bubbles of real space around the ships. The Death Guard had no reason to expect this voyage would differ from the hundreds of warp transits they had completed previously. Kala's Typhon had been preparing for this moment since before the rebellion began. The first captain's corruption by Nurgle had progressed far beyond what Mortarion understood, his body already hosting changes that would have revealed his true allegiance if anyone had examined him closely enough. Typhon had been communicating with entities in the warp for years, receiving instructions and promises from the Plague God, who saw in the Death Guard a legion perfectly suited to his domain. The warriors who had been conditioned to endure toxins and disease, who took pride in their ability to function in conditions that would kill others, who followed a Primarch obsessed with endurance and resistance to suffering. These were ideal servants for the Chaos God, whose sphere encompassed decay and resilience in equal measure. The first captain had positioned himself to control the critical moment when the Death Guard fleet would be most vulnerable. Typhon held authority over the fleet's navigators, those psychers whose abilities allowed them to perceive the warp's currents and guide vessels through its dangers. He had cultivated relationships with the senior navigators over years of service, earning their trust through consistent support and protection of their interests within the Legion hierarchy. When the Death Guard fleet entered the warp for what should have been a standard transit toward Terra, Typhon enacted the plan he had been developing since his corruption began. The navigators died suddenly and simultaneously across the entire Death Guard fleet. Typhon murdered them personally in some cases, using weapons he had hidden specifically for this purpose. In other instances, he had arranged for agents corrupted to Nurgle's service to eliminate navigators aboard vessels, where the first captain could not be physically present. The deaths occurred within minutes of each other, coordinated with precision that demonstrated how thoroughly Typhon had prepared for this betrayal. The Death Guard fleet found itself blind in the warp, unable to navigate and unable to return to real space without the navigators, whose abilities made warp travel possible. Mortarion's first awareness that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when reports reached his flagship that the navigators were dead and that the fleet had lost its ability to navigate. The Primarch immediately suspected treachery, though he initially assumed this was an attack by loyalist agents or some enemy that had infiltrated the fleet. He ordered investigations and demanded explanations from his senior officers, including Typhon. The first captain expressed appropriate shock and anger at what had occurred, suggesting that loyalist saboteurs must have somehow penetrated Death Guard security. Typhon volunteered to lead the investigation personally, using his authority to control what information reached Mortarion, while ensuring that no evidence pointed toward his actual role in the navigators' deaths. The Death Guard fleet drifted through the warp without guidance or direction, unable to calculate routes or identify their position relative to real space. The vessels maintained their gellar fields, those barriers that kept the warp's inhabitants from physically manifesting aboard the ships, but the fleet was effectively lost in a realm where conventional physics did not apply and where time itself flowed inconsistently. Days aboard the ships might correspond to weeks or months in real space, or the reverse could be true. The Death Guard had provisions and supplies for extended campaigns, but being trapped indefinitely in the warp represented a different kind of danger than simple resource depletion. The currents of the warp began carrying the Death Guard fleet toward a region that existed within Nurgle's domain. The Plague God's realm in the warp manifested as a grotesque garden where diseases grew like plants and where decay was celebrated as the natural state of all things. Nurgle had been reaching toward the Death Guard for years, recognizing in them servants who could spread his gifts across the material universe. The Legion's philosophy of endurance and their Primarch's obsession with resistance to toxins made them perfect vectors for the Plague God's purposes. Where other Chaos Gods might have needed to corrupt the Death Guard gradually, Nurgle could offer them something they would recognize as aligned with their existing values: the ability to endure absolutely anything, to become so resilient that nothing could truly harm them. The Destroyer Plague manifested aboard the Death Guard fleet gradually rather than as a sudden outbreak. It began with minor symptoms that Space Marine physiology should have easily resisted. Warriors reported feeling unusually fatigued, experiencing joint pain and muscle aches that their enhanced biology typically prevented. The Legion's apothecaries initially dismissed these complaints as stress reactions to being trapped in the warp, prescribing standard treatments and expecting the symptoms to resolve quickly. Instead, the conditions worsened with each passing day. The disease progressed into something that defied the apothecaries' understanding of biology or medicine. Space Marines began developing lesions that would not heal, their enhanced regenerative abilities seemingly unable to address wounds that appeared spontaneously across their bodies. The lesions wept fluids that contained infectious agents the apothecaries could not identify or classify. Warriors who had endured toxic atmospheres that would liquefy normal human tissue found themselves weakened by a disease that their conditioning provided no defense against. The Destroyer Plague was not a natural pathogen, but a supernatural manifestation of Nurgle's power, a pestilence that existed partially in the warp and partially in real space, attacking its victims on levels that transcended mere physical infection. Mortarion watched his legion sicken with growing horror and rage. The Primarch had built the Death Guard around the principle that proper conditioning could allow warriors to endure any environment or hazard. He had spent decades training his sons to resist toxins and diseases, pushing their enhanced physiology to extremes that other legions considered excessive. Now that conditioning proved worthless against a plague that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with conventional biology. Death Guard Space Marines, who could breathe atmospheres toxic enough to dissolve unprotected human lungs, found themselves coughing up pieces of their own liquefied organs. Warriors who had fought for days while exposed to radiation that should have been lethal discovered that the Destroyer Plague was killing them more effectively than any battlefield hazard they had encountered. The Primarch threw himself into finding a cure with the same determination he had brought to every challenge he had faced. Mortarion worked alongside the Legion's apothecaries, analyzing samples of the plague and testing potential treatments. His own enhanced physiology and his lifetime of exposure to toxins gave him insights that normal apothecaries lacked, but even Mortarion's expertise proved insufficient. The Destroyer Plague adapted to every treatment they attempted, mutating faster than they could develop countermeasures. Antibiotics that should have eliminated bacterial infections had no effect. Antiviral agents designed to target the plague's apparent viral components proved equally useless. The disease continued spreading through the fleet, infecting more Death Guard with each passing day, while those already sick deteriorated toward death. The psychological impact on the Legion was devastating in ways that physical casualties had never been. The Death Guard had accepted horrific losses during their campaigns, had watched brothers die in conditions that would have broken other forces, but those deaths had occurred in service to objectives they understood. Warriors had died fighting enemies or enduring environmental hazards, sacrificing themselves for tactical purposes or strategic goals. The Destroyer Plague killed without purpose or meaning, reducing proud Space Marines to fevered wrecks who could barely move as their enhanced bodies betrayed them. Death Guard who had marched through rad-saturated wastelands and toxic fog banks now lay in the medical bays, their flesh rotting while they still lived, their organs failing despite the redundant systems that should have kept them functional even with catastrophic damage. Mortarion's own legendary endurance meant that he remained functional longer than his sons, but even the Primarch was not immune to the Destroyer Plague. He began experiencing the same symptoms that had afflicted his warriors, feeling weakness in muscles that had never known true fatigue, developing lesions that his enhanced healing could not close. The Primarch continued working, even as the disease progressed through his system, refusing to acknowledge that he was dying along with his legion. He tested potential cures on himself first, accepting that his enhanced physiology might respond differently than normal Space Marine biology, but willing to take any risk if it might save his sons. The realization that he was failing came gradually. Mortarion had always believed that sufficient determination and proper preparation could overcome any obstacle. He had freed Barbarous through decades of patient resistance and careful planning. He had transformed the Death Guard into a legion capable of operating in conditions that would incapacitate other forces through systematic conditioning and training. His entire philosophy rested on the principle that strength came from self-reliance and that proper preparation could address any challenge. The Destroyer Plague was proving that philosophy inadequate. No amount of determination was curing the disease. No preparation he had implemented protected his warriors from this supernatural pestilence. His legion was dying, and Mortarion lacked the means to save them. Typhon approached his Primarch when the situation had deteriorated to the point where most of the Death Guard were too sick to perform their duties effectively. The first captain had been careful to appear as affected by the plague as everyone else, displaying symptoms that matched what other warriors experienced, while ensuring through Nurgle's gifts that he remained functional. Typhon told Mortarion that he had been seeking solutions through methods the Primarch might not approve of, that he had reached out to entities in the Warp who claimed they could end the Legion's suffering. The first captain described these entities as powers that existed beyond the Emperor's authority, forces that could grant the Death Guard the endurance they had always sought, but through means that transcended the physical conditioning Mortarion had relied upon. Mortarion rejected Typhon's suggestions immediately and absolutely. The Primarch recognized what his first captain was describing, even if Typhon avoided using explicit terms. These were the same kind of warp entities that the overlords of Barbaros had served, the powers that Magnus had advocated engaging with, the forces that represented everything Mortarion had fought against throughout his life. He ordered Typhon to abandon whatever contacts he had made and to focus on finding solutions that did not involve bargaining with beings from the warp. The first captain accepted his Primarch's rebuke with apparent submission, withdrawing to allow Mortarion to continue his futile efforts to cure the Destroyer Plague through conventional means. The Death Guard continued deteriorating as days stretched into weeks aboard the plague-ridden fleet. Warriors who had been merely sick progressed to being incapacitated, lying in the medical bays while their bodies slowly failed despite every effort to sustain them. The apothecaries themselves began succumbing to the plague, reducing the Legion's ability to provide even basic medical care to those still fighting the disease. Mortarion watched his sons die slowly, their enhanced physiology keeping them alive long past the point where normal humans would have expired, extending their suffering rather than granting them quick deaths. The Primarch's resistance to the Destroyer Plague lasted longer than any of his warriors, his unique physiology and his lifetime of exposure to toxins providing advantages that delayed, but could not prevent his eventual deterioration. Mortarion remained conscious and functional, even as the disease reduced him to a state that should have killed him multiple times over. His flesh rotted while he lived, his organs failed and continued functioning through sheer determination, his body becoming a testament to how much suffering a Primarch could endure before finally dying. He continued searching for cures even as his hands shook too badly to handle medical instruments properly, continued analyzing data even as his vision blurred from the fluids weeping from lesions around his eyes. Typhon returned when Mortarion had been reduced to near complete incapacitation, when the Primarch lay in his chambers unable to rise, his body finally betraying him after resisting the plague for far longer than should have been possible. The first captain explained that the offer remained available, that the powers he had contacted were willing to save the Death Guard in exchange for service. Mortarion refused again, his voice barely audible but his determination unchanged. He would not trade his soul or his son's souls to entities from the warp, would not become the kind of corrupted being he had spent his life fighting against. The Primarch told Typhon that he would rather die and take the entire Legion with him than accept such a bargain. The first captain left his Primarch to suffer, understanding that Mortarion's resistance would eventually break not through argument, but through the accumulated weight of watching his Legion die. The Death Guard continued their slow dissolution, the plague killing them incrementally, while keeping them conscious enough to experience every moment of their deterioration. The fleet drifted deeper into Nurgle's realm, the Gellar fields weakening as the plague's supernatural nature began affecting the technology that maintained those barriers between real space and the warp. Mortarion's final resistance collapsed when he understood that his death would not end his Legion's suffering. The Primarch had believed that if he died refusing to bargain with the warp powers, the Death Guard would at least perish with their integrity intact, that they would die as loyal servants of the rebellion against the Emperor, rather than as corrupted slaves to entities worse than any tyrant. However, the Destroyer Plague was not killing the Death Guard quickly enough for such a clean ending. His warriors were trapped in a state between life and death, suffering without end, unable to die but unable to recover. Mortarion realized that his refusal to accept Typhon's offer was not preserving his son's integrity, but was instead condemning them to prolonged agony that served no purpose except to satisfy his own philosophical principles. The Primarch called Typhon to his chambers and told his first captain to arrange whatever bargain was necessary to end the Death Guard's suffering. Mortarion understood what he was agreeing to even if Typhon had avoided stating the terms explicitly. He was trading his soul and his Legion's souls to powers from the warp, becoming exactly what he had always despised, accepting corruption from entities that would transform him into something far worse than the overlords of Barbaros had ever been. The alternative was allowing his sons to suffer indefinitely, dying by increments while trapped in a warp-born hell that Mortarion lacked the power to escape through his own capabilities. Nurgle's acceptance of Mortarion's capitulation was immediate and absolute. The Plague God had been preparing for this moment since Typhon first made contact, had crafted the Destroyer Plague specifically to break the Primarch's resistance, and to demonstrate that self-reliance had limits that only divine power could transcend. The transformation began instantly, the supernatural disease that had been killing the Death Guard suddenly reversing its effects, while simultaneously changing them into something that could never be called fully human or even fully space marine. The Death Guard's bodies absorbed the Destroyer Plague rather than being cured of it, the disease becoming part of their fundamental nature instead of an external infection. Their flesh swelled and bloated, taking on the pallid color and corrupt texture of bodies that had been dead for weeks, but somehow remained animate. The lesions that had wept infectious fluids sealed themselves, leaving scars that pulsed with unnatural vitality. Their armor fused with their transformed flesh, ceramite and corrupted tissue, merging into hybrid forms where the boundaries between equipment and body became meaningless. The Death Guard became Plague Marines, warriors who embodied disease and decay while possessing resilience that exceeded what they had achieved through Mortarion's conditioning programs. Mortarion's own transformation surpassed what his warriors experienced, befitting his status as a Primarch and reflecting Nurgle's particular favor. His body swelled to even greater size, his already towering frame becoming truly massive as corrupt vitality flooded through him. Wings erupted from his back, tattered and rotting but functional, marking him as something beyond mortal. His scythe's silence, the weapon he had carried since Barbarous, became a demon weapon infused with Nurgle's power, capable of inflicting wounds that would never heal and spreading plagues with each strike. The Primarch became a demon prince of Nurgle, a being that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, empowered by the Plague God's gifts while bound eternally to his service. Typhon underwent his own transformation, revealing the full extent of his corruption and his role in engineering the Death Guard's damnation. The first captain's body had already been changing before the Destroyer Plague manifested, his flesh hosting Nurgle's gifts for years, while he maintained the appearance of a normal space marine. Now those changes manifested completely, his body becoming a hive for demonic insects that nested in his rotting flesh. He became Typhus, the herald of Nurgle and the host of the Destroyer Hive, his very presence spreading plague wherever he walked. The Terminator armor he wore fused with his corrupted flesh just as the Plague Marine's armor had, becoming part of him rather than merely equipment he donned. The Death Guard fleet emerged from the warp fundamentally changed from what had entered it. Where they had been traitor space marines rebelling against the Emperor's authority, they were now corrupted servants of chaos who existed to spread Nurgle's plagues across the galaxy. Their ships had transformed along with their crews, the vessels becoming plague-ridden hulks that leaked corruption into real space wherever they traveled. The Gellar fields that should have protected them from the warp's inhabitants no longer functioned normally, allowing demonic entities to manifest aboard the ships and mingle with the Plague Marines who now welcomed such presences. Mortarion commanded his transformed legion with full awareness of what he had become and what he had sacrificed. The Primarch had traded everything he believed in to end his son's suffering, had accepted corruption from powers he had spent his life opposing, had become a demon prince serving a chaos god whose very existence represented the kind of supernatural tyranny he had fought against on Barbarous. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He had rebelled against the Emperor to escape what he saw as tyranny, only to bind himself to a power infinitely worse than anything the master of mankind had represented. His quest for liberation from the Emperor's authority had led him into slavery to Nurgle. His determination to rely on his own strength had proven insufficient, and his philosophy of self-reliance had been revealed as inadequate against forces that operated beyond the material realm he understood. The transformation that Nurgle inflicted upon Mortarion represented the ultimate corruption of everything the Primarch had fought for throughout his existence. Where he had once been a towering warrior whose pale flesh bore the scars of Barbarous's toxic atmosphere, he became something that could no longer be mistaken for remotely human. His body swelled to proportions that exceeded even his original Primarch stature, bloated with corrupt vitality that made his frame massive in ways that suggested disease rather than strength. The flesh that had been merely pale became the color of corpses left to rot for weeks, mottled with patches of green and purple discoloration where decay had set in despite his continued animation. His face, which had retained a grim nobility even through decades of warfare, became a death mask where sunken eyes glowed with sickly phosphorescence, and his features sagged as though the underlying bone structure was dissolving. The wings that erupted from Mortarion's back during his apotheosis represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of Nurgle's gifts. They were massive, easily spanning 15 meters when fully extended, but they appeared as though they had been grafted from some enormous insect that had died and partially decomposed. The wing membranes were tattered and torn, hanging in strips that should have made flight impossible, yet they bore Mortarion aloft through some principle that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. The wings leaked fluids constantly, dripping pestilent ichor that hissed when it struck surfaces and left corrosive stains that never faded. When Mortarion flew, the sound was not the rush of air over wings, but a wet buzzing that resembled swarms of flies, a noise that induced nausea in anyone who heard it and announced his presence long before he became visible. His armor underwent transformation along with his body, the artificer plate that had been crafted to his specifications, fusing with his corrupt flesh, until the boundaries between equipment and biology became meaningless. The ceramite took on the same diseased coloration as his skin, green and brown stains spreading across surfaces that had once been maintained in Deathguard gray. The armor systems continued functioning despite appearing corroded and damaged beyond any hope of repair, pipes leaking fluids that should have indicated catastrophic failures, but which somehow maintained pressure, power systems crackling with energy that manifested as sickly green lightning rather than the clean blue of normal plasma containment. Nurgle's gifts ensured that nothing Mortarion wore or carried would ever truly fail, but neither would anything appear clean or properly maintained. His very existence became a statement that functionality and corruption were not opposites, but could coexist in forms that defied conventional understanding. The scythe's silence underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any of Mortarion's equipment. The weapon had been forged on Barbarous, a massive two-handed blade that the Primarch had wielded since his days fighting the overlords. It had been a practical tool for a practical warrior, without the ornate decorations or ceremonial elements that characterize some Primarch's weapons. Nurgle's corruption transformed silence into a demon weapon, binding entities from the warp into the blade's structure, and infusing it with supernatural properties that made it far deadlier than any conventional weapon could be. The metal of the blade became pitted and corroded, appearing as though it had been left exposed to caustic chemicals for centuries, yet the edge remained impossibly sharp. The weapon's length extended during the transformation, growing from approximately 3 meters to nearly 5, the handle wrapping with what appeared to be decayed leather, but which was actually some form of demonic hide that writhed slightly when touched. Silence's new properties reflected Nurgle's domain over disease and entropy. Wounds inflicted by the blade refused to heal through any normal means, the demon weapon's touch introducing supernatural infections that spread through victims' bodies regardless of their enhanced physiology or medical treatment. Space Marines struck by Silence found their Laraman cells unable to clot the wounds, their Susan membrane failing to induce healing comas, their enhanced immune systems completely ineffective against infections that operated according to warp-based principles rather than biological ones. The blade could carve through ceramite armor and reinforced structures with equal ease, the demon entities bound within it, allowing Mortarion to strike at both material and immaterial targets. Demons and warp entities that would be immune to conventional weapons discovered that Silence could harm them as effectively as it harmed mortal beings, the weapon existing partially in real space and partially in the warp simultaneously. The pistol lantern represented Mortarion's second primary weapon, a sidearm he had carried since Barbarous that underwent its own corruption during his transformation. The weapon had originally been a practical tool, a large caliber pistol designed to deliver devastating firepower at close range when the scythe proved impractical. Nurgle's touch transformed Lantern into something far more sinister, a weapon that fired not conventional ammunition, but concentrated manifestations of a specific plague known as Nurgle's rot. This supernatural disease represented one of the plague god's most virulent gifts, a pestilence that affected both living tissue and spiritual essence simultaneously. Victims struck by Lantern's projectiles found their flesh liquefying, while their souls became infected with corruption that would persist even after death, transforming them eventually into plague-bearers, the lesser demons that served Nurgle in his garden. The physical effects of Nurgle's rot were horrific to witness and agonizing to experience. Flesh struck by the disease began rotting immediately, the infection spreading from the point of impact through the victim's body at speeds that varied based on their resistance and Nurgle's whim. Enhanced physiology provided some protection against the disease's physical manifestations, but could not prevent the spiritual corruption that accompanied it. Space Marines hit by Lantern's fire experienced their enhanced organs failing as the disease attacked them on levels their biology was never designed to resist. Their black carapace, which should have provided protection against environmental hazards, instead became a vector for the infection to spread across their entire bodies. The pain was reportedly beyond what even Space Marine pain editors could suppress, as the disease attacked nerve tissue directly, while simultaneously preventing the victim from losing consciousness or dying quickly. Mortarion's transformation granted him abilities that extended far beyond enhanced physical capabilities or powerful weapons. His very presence became a vector for plague and corruption, his body constantly radiating an aura of entropy that affected everything in his vicinity. The air around the Daemon Primarch grew thick and difficult to breathe, not merely because of toxic fumes, but because the atmosphere itself became infected with supernatural pestilence. Unprotected humans who approached within 100 meters of Mortarion found themselves struggling to breathe as their lungs began failing, their bodies developing lesions and infections that progressed with unnatural speed. Even Space Marines in sealed armor experienced degradation of their equipment systems when exposed to the Daemon Primarch's aura for extended periods, air filtration systems clogging with growths that should not have been able to survive in such environments, power armor servos seizing as lubricants transformed into corrosive sludges. The Daemon Primarch gained the ability to manifest plagues consciously rather than merely radiating corruption passively. Mortarion could summon diseases from Nurgle's garden and release them upon battlefields or population centers, creating outbreaks that spread with supernatural efficiency and resisted all attempts at containment or treatment. These were not natural plagues that followed predictable patterns of infection and progression, but warp-spawned pestilences that adapted to overcome whatever defenses were deployed against them. A plague that Mortarion released upon a hive world might begin as a respiratory infection, but mutate into a bloodborne pathogen when authorities implemented quarantine protocols, then transform again into a contact-transmitted disease when medical personnel began treating victims while wearing protective equipment. The supernatural nature of these plagues meant that conventional epidemiology provided no useful insights, as the diseases operated according to Nurgle's will rather than biological principles. The miasmas that Mortarion could generate represented another manifestation of his Demon Prince abilities, clouds of toxic vapor that combined physical poisons with warp-based corruption. These miasmas appeared as thick fogs colored in shades of green and brown, roiling masses that obscured vision while simultaneously attacking anything they contacted. The Daemon Primarch could summon these clouds to engulf entire battlefields, transforming combat zones into environments where only forces blessed by Nurgle could operate effectively. The miasmas corroded armor and equipment while infecting anyone who breathed them, creating situations where enemy forces found themselves simultaneously fighting the Death Guard and struggling against environmental hazards that grew more lethal with each passing moment. Unlike natural toxic fogs that would disperse given time and wind, Mortarion's miasmas persisted until he chose to dismiss them, hanging over battlefields for days or weeks and rendering entire regions uninhabitable to anyone lacking supernatural resistance to disease and decay. The immortality that Nurgle granted Mortarion represented perhaps the most fundamental change from his previous existence. As a Primarch, he had been extraordinarily difficult to kill, his enhanced physiology capable of surviving wounds that would have been instantly fatal to Space Marines. As a Demon Prince, he became effectively unkillable through conventional means. Wounds that should have been lethal simply failed to stop him, his corrupt flesh regenerating damage through principles that had nothing to do with normal healing processes. Mortarion could be struck by weapons that would have killed him in his previous form and continue fighting without apparent impediment, his body simply ignoring damage that should have incapacitated him. This was not invulnerability in the sense of being unable to be harmed, but rather a fundamental disconnect between physical damage and functional capability. The Demon Primarch could be wounded, could have portions of his body destroyed or severed, but such injuries did not translate into reduced combat effectiveness or eventual death. The true nature of this immortality became apparent in the rare instances where Mortarion suffered sufficient damage that his physical form could no longer maintain cohesion. When his body was destroyed through overwhelming force or through weapons specifically designed to harm demon entities, his essence simply retreated into the warp rather than experiencing true death. Within Nurgle's garden, the Demon Primarch's form would reconstitute over time, the process taking weeks or months depending on the severity of the destruction he had suffered. Once reformed, Mortarion could return to real space and resume his activities, the defeat representing an inconvenience rather than a permanent setback. This cycle of destruction and reformation meant that the Demon Primarch could not be permanently eliminated through military action alone, as any victory against him was necessarily temporary. The relationship between Mortarion and Nurgle developed along lines that differed significantly from how many demon princes related to their patron gods. The Plague God had claimed the Primarch through a combination of systematic corruption and exploitation of desperate circumstances, breaking Mortarion's resistance by forcing him to choose between his principles and his legion's survival. This method of corruption created a dynamic where Mortarion served Nurgle not out of genuine devotion, but because he had been maneuvered into a position where service was the only option that allowed him to continue existing. The Demon Primarch understood exactly what had been done to him, recognized that he had been manipulated into accepting corruption he had spent his life opposing, and retained enough of his original personality to resent the circumstances that had led to his damnation. Nurgle seemed to find Mortarion's bitterness amusing rather than problematic, the Plague God's nature encompassing acceptance of all things, including the resentment of servants who had not chosen their service voluntarily. The Demon Primarch received Nurgle's gifts and blessings as fully as any devoted follower would have, his effectiveness as a champion of disease and decay undiminished by his lack of enthusiasm for his role. Mortarion spread plagues across the galaxy, not because he believed in Nurgle's vision, but because doing so represented his function within the hierarchy he had been forced into. The irony that he had become exactly what he had always fought against was not lost on him, and that awareness manifested as a perpetual undercurrent of rage that colored all his actions. This complicated relationship meant that Mortarion maintained more independence than many demon princes enjoyed. He served Nurgle's interests because he was bound to do so through the transformation that had made him a demon prince, but within those constraints, he exercised considerable autonomy in how he prosecuted campaigns and what objectives he prioritized. The Demon Primarch could not refuse direct commands from Nurgle when the Plague God chose to issue them, but such explicit orders were relatively rare. Most of the time, Mortarion operated according to his own strategic judgment, spreading corruption and leading the Death Guard in campaigns that aligned with Nurgle's broader goals without requiring constant divine guidance. This autonomy allowed him to retain some sense of agency, though he understood that even this limited independence existed only because Nurgle permitted it. The powers that Mortarion wielded as a demon prince extended to influence over the Death Guard and over the various plague-related entities that served Nurgle. Lesser demons responded to his commands as readily as they would to direct instructions from the plague god himself, plague bearers and Nurglings manifesting at his summons to reinforce Death Guard operations or to spread infections in areas where the traitor legion could not deploy directly. The Demon Primarch could sense disease and decay across vast distances, his awareness extending to any significant outbreak of plague, whether natural or supernatural in origin. This perception allowed him to identify worlds ripe for corruption and to coordinate Death Guard deployments to maximize the spread of Nurgle's influence across the galaxy. The transformation had not eliminated Mortarion's tactical acumen or his understanding of warfare, though it had fundamentally altered how he applied those capabilities. Where he had once commanded the Death Guard in grinding campaigns that emphasized endurance and systematic reduction of enemy capabilities, he now orchestrated operations that combined conventional military force with supernatural plague. His strategies involved deploying the Death Guard to establish beachheads on target worlds, then using his Demon Prince abilities to manifest diseases that would weaken defending forces and create conditions where only Nurgle-blessed warriors could operate effectively. The combination of military expertise and supernatural power made Mortarion one of the most dangerous commanders serving the forces of chaos, his campaigns achieving objectives that would have been impossible for purely military forces or for demon entities operating without mortal support. The Demon Primarch's appearance on battlefields created effects that extended beyond his personal combat capabilities. His mere presence inspired terror in enemy forces who recognized what he represented, the corruption made manifest in a form that had once been one of the Emperor's sons. Loyalist space marines who faced Mortarion in combat experienced psychological impacts that their conditioning and indoctrination struggled to address, as they found themselves fighting a being that embodied the failure of everything the Imperium claimed to stand for. The fact that a Primarch could fall so completely, could be transformed into a champion of the very forces the Emperor had created him to fight against, represented a fundamental challenge to Imperial ideology that could not be easily dismissed or rationalized. Mortarion's combat style, as a Demon Prince, retained elements of his previous approach, while incorporating the supernatural abilities his transformation had granted. He still wielded silence with the same methodical efficiency he had demonstrated before his corruption, the scythe carving through enemy formations with sweeps that killed multiple opponents with each strike. The difference was that now those strikes carried supernatural infections that spread through enemy forces, wounds that refused to heal becoming vectors for plagues that could devastate entire companies. His use of Lantern remained tactical rather than profligate, the Demon Primarch deploying Nurgles wrought against specific targets whose corruption would serve strategic purposes rather than simply firing indiscriminately. When he manifested miasmas or summoned plagues, he did so with clear objectives in mind, using his supernatural abilities as tools to achieve military goals rather than as ends in themselves. The 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy have seen Mortarion lead the Death Guard in countless campaigns across the galaxy, each one spreading Nurgle's corruption to new worlds and populations. His effectiveness as a champion of the Plague God has never been in question, his combination of military expertise and Demon Prince powers making him one of the most successful servants of chaos in achieving tangible results. However, the bitterness that characterized his initial transformation has never fully dissipated, the Demon Primarch continuing to serve Nurgle while maintaining an undercurrent of resentment about the circumstances that led to his damnation. This makes him a more complex figure than many demon princes, a being who fully embraces his role as a spreader of plague and corruption while simultaneously hating what he has become and what he represents. The Death Guard emerged from the warp as something fundamentally different from what had entered it. Where they had been traitor space marines serving Horus's rebellion against the Emperor, they were now plague marines bound to Nurgle's service, their bodies transformed into hosts for supernatural disease and their ships carrying corruption that leaked into real space wherever they traveled. Mortarion commanded his transformed legion with full awareness that the original objectives of the heresy had become secondary to his new obligations as a demon prince. However, the campaign against Terra remained strategically necessary for both Horus's rebellion and for Nurgle's purposes, as the Imperial Palace represented the greatest concentration of humanity in the galaxy, and therefore the most valuable target for spreading the plague god's gifts. The journey to Terra took longer than anticipated, even accounting for the time the Death Guard had spent trapped in the warp. The fleet's transformation had affected their vessel's capabilities in ways that made conventional warp travel difficult. The ship's machine spirits corrupted along with everything else, and their systems operating according to principles that combined technology with demonic influence. The Death Guard arrived at Terra behind schedule, finding that other traitor forces had already begun the assault on the Imperial Palace's outer defenses. Horus had established his command position and was coordinating the siege's overall strategy, while other traitor legions prosecuted attacks against different sections of the massive fortification network that protected the Emperor's seat of power. Mortarion's physical appearance shocked even those traitor Primarchs who had themselves undergone transformations during the heresy. His massive, bloated form and the tattered wings that carried him aloft marked him immediately as something that had transcended the boundaries between Primarch and demon. Horus recognized what had occurred and understood that Mortarion's transformation represented both an asset and a complication for the siege. The Death Guard's enhanced capabilities would prove valuable in assaults against fortifications that other forces struggled to breach, but their corruption was so complete that coordination with traitor forces who had not embraced chaos to the same degree would be difficult. The War Master assigned the Death Guard to operations where their specialized nature would provide maximum advantage, targeting sections of the Imperial Palace's defenses where conventional assault would be prohibitively expensive. The Lion's Gate spaceport represented one of the most critical strategic objectives in the entire siege. This massive facility served as the primary landing zone for ships bringing supplies and reinforcements to the Imperial Palace, a sprawling complex that covered dozens of square kilometers and featured defensive systems that could repel fleet-level assaults. The spaceport's void shields and anti-aircraft batteries made direct orbital assault impossible, while its ground-level fortifications had been designed to withstand siege warfare from armies numbering in the millions. Previous traitor assaults against the Lion's Gate had achieved limited success, with attacking forces suffering catastrophic casualties against defenses that the Loyalists reinforced faster than the traitors could reduce them. Mortarion approached the Lion's Gate spaceport with tactics that reflected both his military expertise and his Demon Prince capabilities. The Death Guard deployed in strength around the facility's perimeter, establishing siege lines that prevented Loyalist reinforcement while the Plague Marines prepared for the actual assault. The Demon Primarch personally manifested plagues across the spaceport's defensive positions, releasing diseases that spread through the Loyalist garrison despite their sealed armor and environmental protections. These were not natural pestilences that conventional quarantine could contain, but supernatural infections that operated according to warp-based principles, adapting to overcome whatever countermeasures the defenders implemented. The diseases that Mortarion unleashed within the Lion's Gate spaceport attacked defenders on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical symptoms included respiratory failure, as lungs filled with fluids that the body produced faster than they could be expelled, lesions that appeared spontaneously across skin and internal organs, and fevers that rose to temperatures that should have killed victims, but instead left them conscious and suffering. The psychological impact proved equally devastating as defenders watched their brothers sicken and die despite receiving the best medical care available, as apothecaries discovered that their training and equipment provided no defense against infections that defied biological principles. The supernatural nature of the plagues meant that even diagnosing what was killing the garrison proved impossible, as samples taken from victims showed different pathogens each time they were analyzed, the diseases mutating faster than any analysis could track. The Death Guard assault on the Lion's Gate spaceport began after weeks of plague had reduced the garrison's effectiveness to the point where conventional defense became impossible. Plague Marines advanced through defensive positions that should have stopped any attack, their corrupted bodies absorbing firepower that would have devastated normal Space Marines. Bolter rounds that struck Plague Marines punched through their armor and detonated inside their bodies, but the warriors continued fighting despite wounds that should have been instantly fatal. Their enhanced resilience combined with Nurgle's gifts meant that destroying a Plague Marine required inflicting damage so catastrophic that their physical forms could no longer maintain cohesion, a threshold far beyond what conventional weapons could reliably achieve. Mortarion led the assault personally, his massive form visible across the battlefield as he carved through loyalist defensive positions with silence. The Demon Scythe killed with each strike, its blade passing through ceramite armor and reinforced structures as though they were paper. Loyalist Space Marines who survived wounds from silence discovered that their injuries would not heal, the demon weapon's touch introducing infections that spread through their enhanced bodies despite their biological advantages. The Daemon Primarchs' presence created zones where the atmosphere itself became lethal, unprotected humans dying within seconds of exposure, while even Space Marines in sealed armor experienced equipment failures as their suit systems corroded from exposure to the supernatural miasmas that surrounded him. The fighting within the Lion's Gate spaceport devolved into brutal close-quarters combat as the Death Guard pushed deeper into the facility. Loyalist defenders established strongpoints in the spaceport's internal structures, using the complex's architecture to create choke points where they could concentrate their firepower against the advancing Plague Marines. These defensive positions slowed the Death Guard advance but could not stop it, as Mortarion's forces simply accepted casualties that would have forced other attackers to withdraw and continued pressing forward. The Plague Marines fought with methodical determination rather than frenzied aggression, their advance resembling a tide that rose incrementally but inexorably rather than a wave that crashed and receded. The spaceport's fall came after months of grinding combat that reduced much of the facility to rubble. The Death Guard secured the Lion's Gate not through any single decisive breakthrough, but through systematic reduction of loyalist defensive positions. Each strongpoint falling after its garrison had been weakened by plague and ground down through sustained assault. The cost in Plague Marine casualties was substantial even by Death Guard standards, but Mortarion considered the losses acceptable given the strategic value of denying the Imperial Palace its primary supply route. The corrupted spaceport became a Death Guard stronghold from which they could launch further operations against the palace's outer defenses, a festering wound in the Loyalist defensive network that continued spreading corruption into surrounding areas. The Death Guard's advance beyond the Lion's Gate spaceport brought them into the outer defensive rings that protected the Imperial Palace proper. These fortifications had been constructed over centuries, layer upon layer of walls and bunkers and fire positions, designed to channel attackers into killing zones, where the defenders could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The architecture reflected the accumulated expertise of the Imperial Fist's Legion, who had been tasked with fortifying Terra against exactly the kind of assault that was now occurring. Rogel Dorn had prepared defenses that could theoretically withstand siege warfare indefinitely, provided the garrison maintained sufficient supplies and morale. Mortarion's approach to reducing these fortifications combined conventional siege tactics with the systematic application of plague. The Death Guard established positions within range of Loyalist defenses and began sustained bombardment with conventional weapons mixed with shells containing plague-infected materials. The bombardment served dual purposes, degrading physical fortifications while simultaneously introducing diseases into the defensive positions. Loyalist forces found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously, defending against Death Guard assaults while also struggling against outbreaks of supernatural pestilence that spread through their ranks despite all quarantine protocols. The plagues that the Death Guard deployed against the Imperial Palace's outer defenses were calibrated to maximize disruption rather than to simply kill as efficiently as possible. Mortarion understood that dead defenders could be replaced more easily than sick ones, as corpses required only removal, while diseased warriors consumed medical resources and spread infection to those who treated them. The diseases he manifested caused symptoms that were debilitating without being immediately fatal, reducing defenders' combat effectiveness while forcing the Loyalists to divert personnel and supplies to medical treatment. Respiratory infections left warriors struggling to breathe inside their armor, forcing them to reduce their activity levels or risk suffocation. Infections that attacked nerve tissue caused tremors and reduced coordination, making it difficult for defenders to aim weapons accurately or to respond quickly to threats. The psychological warfare aspects of the Death Guard's assault proved as effective as their military operations. Loyalist forces defending the Imperial Palace had been prepared for conventional siege warfare, for assaults by traitor space marines who could be killed through sufficient application of firepower. The Plague Marines represented something fundamentally different, enemies who absorbed damage that should have stopped them, and who spread corruption simply through their presence. Defenders who witnessed Plague Marines continuing to fight despite wounds that had blown away portions of their bodies experienced challenges to their understanding of what was possible, their training and doctrine providing no framework for processing enemies who operated according to principles that defied conventional military logic. Mortarion's confrontation with Jagatai Khan occurred during one of the Death Guard's assaults against the outer defensive rings. The White Scars Primarch had been leading mobile defense operations, using his legion's speed and maneuverability to strike at traitor forces and withdraw before the enemy could bring their full strength to bear. Jagatai had been monitoring the Death Guard's advance and recognized that Mortarion's methodical approach created opportunities for the kind of rapid strike that the White Scars specialized in. The Khan led a force that penetrated Death Guard positions and struck directly at Mortarion's command position, seeking to kill or wound the Daemon Primarchs severely enough to disrupt the Death Guard's operations. The two Primarchs had never been close during the Great Crusade, their personalities and tactical preferences too different to allow for genuine friendship. Jagatai valued speed and mobility, leading his legion in lightning strikes that achieved objectives through maneuver rather than through sustained combat. Mortarion preferred methodical warfare that emphasized endurance and systematic reduction of enemy capabilities, viewing the White Scars' approach as flashy but ultimately superficial. Their philosophical differences had occasionally created friction during joint operations, though both Primarchs had maintained professional working relationships despite their personal incompatibility. The confrontation on Terra transformed those old tensions into active hostility rooted in ideological opposition. Jagatai saw in Mortarion's corruption the ultimate validation of his concerns about the traitor Primarch's choices, proof that rebellion against the Emperor led inevitably to damnation and service to powers far worse than any imperial authority. The Khan had remained loyal not out of blind obedience, but because he believed the Emperor represented humanity's best hope for survival in a hostile galaxy, that the alternative to imperial unity was fragmentation and vulnerability to threats like the Chaos Gods who had corrupted Mortarion. The Daemon Primarch's transformation into a bloated, diseased monster served as evidence that the traitors had chosen poorly, that their rebellion had delivered them into slavery far more absolute than anything they had experienced under imperial authority. Mortarion viewed Jagatai's loyalty as willful blindness to the Emperor's true nature. The Khan served a tyrant who had positioned himself as humanity's absolute ruler through genetic engineering and psychic powers that ordinary humans could never access, who demanded obedience and offered no real choice about whether to accept imperial authority. The fact that the Emperor's tyranny might be more benevolent than the Chaos God's corruption did not make it less tyrannical in Mortarion's assessment. The Daemon Primarch had accepted Nurgle's gifts out of desperate necessity rather than genuine choice, and he retained enough self-awareness to recognize that his current state represented damnation rather than liberation. However, he considered his corruption preferable to continued service to the Emperor, viewing his transformation as the price of escaping one form of tyranny, even if it meant accepting another. The duel between the two Primarchs occurred in the ruins of defensive positions that the Death Guard had recently overrun. Jaghatai fought with the speed and precision that characterized White Scar's combat doctrine, his blade striking at vulnerabilities in Mortarion's defenses and withdrawing before the Demon Primarch could retaliate effectively. The Khan's weapons were master-crafted and had been blessed by the Emperor's own artificers, giving them capabilities beyond normal Primarch equipment. Each strike that connected with Mortarion's corrupted flesh caused damage that even his Demon Prince regeneration struggled to repair immediately, the blessed weapons attacking both his physical form and the warp-based essence that sustained his existence. Mortarion fought with the methodical approach that had always characterized his combat style, accepting wounds that would have forced other combatants to withdraw while seeking opportunities to land decisive strikes with silence. The Demon Scythe's reach advantage allowed him to threaten Jaghatai at ranges where the Khan's shorter blades could not retaliate, forcing the White Scar's Primarch to maneuver constantly to avoid the sweeping strikes that would have killed him instantly. The Demon Primarch manifested miasmas and plagues around the combat zone, transforming the battlefield into an environment where Jaghatai struggled to breathe despite his armor's environmental seals. The White Scar's forces that had accompanied their Primarch found themselves fighting both the Death Guard and the supernatural corruption that Mortarion radiated, their assault losing momentum as the environment itself became an enemy. The Khan's speed ultimately proved decisive in a duel where both combatants possessed advantages that balanced each other. Jaghatai struck at Mortarion's throat with a precision thrust that penetrated the Demon Primarch's defenses, his blade cutting deep into corrupted flesh and severing structures that even Demon Prince regeneration could not immediately repair. The wound was not fatal in any permanent sense, as Mortarion's essence would eventually reconstitute his physical form, even if his body was completely destroyed. However, the damage was severe enough to force the Demon Primarch to withdraw from immediate combat, his body struggling to maintain cohesion, while his regenerative abilities worked to repair the catastrophic injury. The Death Guard forces covering Mortarion's retreat fought with desperate intensity to prevent the White Scars from pursuing their wounded Primarch. Plague Marines established defensive positions in the ruins and accepted casualties that allowed Mortarion to pull back to safer positions, where he could focus on regenerating without the distraction of active combat. Jaghatai recognized that pressing the pursuit would cost more White Scars' lives than the potential gain justified, as the Death Guard had demonstrated their willingness to die to the last warrior to protect their Primarch. The Khan withdrew with his forces, the engagement representing a tactical victory for the Loyalists, but falling short of the decisive blow that might have eliminated Mortarion permanently. The wound that Jaghatai inflicted took weeks to fully heal despite Mortarion's Demon Prince regeneration, the blessed weapons having caused damage that resisted supernatural repair. The Demon Primarch's temporary incapacitation disrupted Death Guard operations during a critical phase of the siege, forcing his subordinate commanders to prosecute assaults without his direct leadership and without the supernatural support that his presence provided. The Death Guard continued their methodical advance against the Imperial Palace's defenses, but their progress slowed noticeably in Mortarion's absence, as Loyalist forces no longer had to contend with the plagues and miasmas that the Demon Primarch manifested. The Siege of Terra reached its climax with the Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. Mortarion was not present for this final battle, his forces still engaged in reducing the Imperial Palace's outer defenses when word came that Horus had been killed and that the traitor fleet was beginning to withdraw. The news reached the Death Guard through multiple channels simultaneously, some reports suggesting that the War Master had been slain by the Emperor personally, while others claimed that Horus had been killed by his own ambitions and the Chaos God's abandonment. The details mattered less than the strategic reality that the siege had failed, and that remaining traitor forces needed to retreat before Loyalist reinforcements arrived to trap them on Terra. The Death Guard withdrawal from Terra occurred in relatively good order compared to some other traitor legions whose retreat devolved into panicked flight. Mortarion commanded his forces to disengage systematically, establishing rearguard positions that covered the Legion's movement back to their ships while preventing Loyalist forces from pursuing too aggressively. The Plague Marines accepted casualties during the withdrawal with the same grim determination they had shown throughout the siege, rearguard companies, fighting to the last warrior to buy time for the rest of the Legion to reach the extraction points. The Death Guard fleet departed Terra with most of its strength intact, though the Legion had suffered substantial losses during the months of siege warfare. The retreat into the Eye of Terror represented the Traitor Legion's only viable option following the heresy's failure. This massive warp storm had existed for millennia as a region where real space and the warp overlapped, creating a zone where the normal laws of physics did not consistently apply, and where demon entities could manifest without the constraints that limited them in normal space. The Eye offered sanctuary from Imperial pursuit, as Loyalist fleets that entered the region faced navigation challenges and warp-based hazards that made sustained operations effectively impossible. However, sanctuary within the Eye came at the cost of constant exposure to chaos corruption and to the whims of the Chaos Gods who claimed the region as their domain. Mortarion led the Death Guard into the Eye with full awareness that there would be no return to the Imperium they had once served. The Daemon Primarch had burned every bridge connecting him to his previous existence, his transformation and his actions during the heresy, ensuring that the Emperor would never accept his return, even if he somehow wished to seek reconciliation. The Death Guard were exiles from the Imperium they had helped build during the Great Crusade, condemned to existence within a warp storm where reality itself was negotiable, and where Nurgle's influence pervaded everything. The establishment of the Plague Planet as Mortarion's primary domain occurred gradually rather than through any single act of creation. The Daemon Primarch claimed a world within the Eye of Terror that already showed signs of Nurgle's corruption, a planet where diseases flourished and where decay proceeded at accelerated rates. Mortarion transformed this world into a reflection of Nurgle's garden, a place where entropy and disease were celebrated rather than fought against. The planet's atmosphere became thick with spores and pathogens, its surface covered with structures that appeared to be rotting even as they were constructed, its population consisting of plague marines and demon entities who existed in states between life and death. The Plague Planet served multiple purposes for the Death Guard and for Nurgle's broader objectives. It functioned as a base of operations from which Mortarion could launch raids into real space, a staging ground where the Legion could marshal forces and prepare for campaigns without the logistical constraints that would have applied in normal space. The planet also served as a laboratory where new plagues could be developed and tested, diseases that would be deployed against Imperial worlds during the long war that followed the heresy. Mortarion personally oversaw many of these plague development programs, his experience with toxins and diseases from Barbarous combining with his Demon Prince abilities to create pestilences that defied conventional medical understanding. The 10 millennia following the heresy saw the Death Guard conduct countless raids and campaigns from their sanctuary within the Eye of Terror. Mortarion led his Legion in assaults against Imperial worlds, spreading Nurgle's corruption across the galaxy through systematic application of plague and military force. These campaigns varied in scale from small raids that infected single worlds to major invasions that threatened entire sectors, the Death Guard's capabilities allowing them to project power far beyond what their numbers alone would suggest. The Daemon Primarch's strategic approach remained methodical. Each campaign planned to maximize the spread of disease while minimizing Death Guard casualties, the Legion's immortal nature allowing them to accept losses that would have destroyed conventional military forces. The Great Rifts tearing across the galaxy in the early 42nd millennium represented the most catastrophic warp-based phenomenon since the Age of Strife. This massive wound in reality split the Imperium nearly in half, creating a barrier that made travel and communication between the two halves extraordinarily difficult. The Cicatrix Maledictum, as the rift came to be known, unleashed warp storms and demonic incursions across thousands of systems simultaneously, overwhelming Imperial defenses that had been designed to handle localized chaos threats rather than galaxy-spanning catastrophe. For the forces of chaos, the Great Rift represented an unprecedented opportunity to strike at the Imperium, while its command structure struggled to coordinate responses across regions that had been effectively isolated from each other. Mortarion recognized the strategic possibilities immediately. The Daemon Primarch had spent 10,000 years conducting raids and campaigns from the Eye of Terror, each operation limited in scope by the logistical challenges of projecting power from within a warp storm into real space. The Great Rift fundamentally altered these calculations by creating stable corridors through which chaos forces could move with far less difficulty than previous warp travel required. The Death Guard could deploy in strength against targets that would have been effectively unreachable before the Rift's opening, and they could sustain operations for extended periods without the supply line vulnerabilities that had constrained previous campaigns. The target Mortarion selected demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his understanding of symbolic warfare's importance. Ultramar represented one of the Imperium's most stable and prosperous regions, a collection of 500 worlds that had maintained relative peace and good governance throughout the Imperium's history. The realm was defended by the Ultramarines chapter, successors to the 13th Legion that Roboute Guilliman had commanded during the Great Crusade and Heresy. Striking at Ultramar would inflict material damage on the Imperium's infrastructure, while simultaneously demonstrating that even the most well-defended regions remained vulnerable to chaos assault. The psychological impact of corrupting Guilliman's own realm would resonate throughout the Imperium, undermining confidence in the defensive strategies that had supposedly kept humanity safe for 10 millennia. The Plague Wars began with Death Guard forces emerging from the Great Rift in numbers that exceeded anything the Daemon Primarch had deployed since the Siege of Terra. Mortarion had marshaled his legion's full strength for this campaign, calling in warbands and companies that had been conducting independent operations across the galaxy. The fleet that assembled in the warp before transiting into Ultramar included hundreds of vessels, from massive battle barges that had survived since the Heresy to smaller raiders that the Death Guard had captured or constructed during their exile. The ships bore the marks of 10,000 years of corruption, their hulls covered with growths and corrosion that should have rendered them non-functional, but which somehow contributed to their effectiveness through principles that combined technology with demonic influence. The initial assaults targeted worlds on Ultramar's periphery, systems that were defended but which lacked the concentration of military forces that protected the realm's core worlds. Death Guard forces deployed through a combination of conventional orbital assault and supernatural manifestation, Plague Marines making combat drops, while Demons of Nurgle appeared directly on planetary surfaces through tiers in reality that Mortarion's presence helped create. The defending Imperial forces found themselves fighting enemies who operated according to multiple paradigms simultaneously, conventional military units that could be engaged with standard tactics existing, alongside demonic entities that required entirely different approaches to combat. Mortarion's strategy for the Plague Wars reflected lessons learned from 10,000 years of raiding Imperial territory. The Daemon Primarch understood that the Death Guard could not hold territory against sustained Imperial counterattacks, that any world they conquered would eventually face reconquest attempts that the Legion lacked the numbers to resist indefinitely. Instead, he focused on transformation rather than occupation, using the Death Guard's military capabilities to establish initial footholds, and then deploying plagues that would corrupt entire worlds so thoroughly that the Imperium would find reconquest pointless even if militarily feasible. A world where the atmosphere had been infected with supernatural diseases, where the water supplies carried plagues that resisted all purification attempts, where the very soil teemed with pathogens that attacked anyone who walked upon it. Such a world might still fly Imperial flags, but it would no longer contribute to the Imperium's strength. The diseases that Mortarion unleashed across Ultramar during the Plague Wars represented some of the most virulent pestilences that Nurgle's garden could produce. These were not the relatively straightforward plagues the Death Guard had deployed during the Heresy, but supernatural infections that had been refined over millennia of development. The walking pox transformed victims into shambling plague zombies called poxwalkers, their bodies hosting diseases while their minds deteriorated until only base instincts remained. The infected retained enough mobility to spread the plague to new victims, while being effectively immune to most conventional weapons, creating situations where Imperial forces had to kill former civilians who had become disease vectors. The psychological impact of having to gun down people they had been defending proved devastating to Imperial Guard morale, while Space Marine forces found that even their enhanced physiology provided limited protection against diseases designed specifically to overcome Astartes' biology. The Ferric Blight targeted machinery and technology rather than organic life, a plague that caused metal to corrode and electronics to fail through mechanisms that defied conventional understanding. Vehicles that had functioned perfectly for centuries suddenly experienced catastrophic systems failures as the blight spread through their components. Weapons jammed or exploded when fired as the plague attacked their internal mechanisms. Even sealed bunkers and fortifications found their structural integrity compromised as the disease ate through reinforced materials that should have been immune to any form of corrosion. The Ferric Blight created situations where Imperial forces lost their technological advantages, reducing combat to close quarters fighting where the Death Guard's enhanced resilience provided decisive superiority. The transformation of entire systems into plague-ridden wastelands proceeded with systematic efficiency as the plague wars continued. Mortarion would identify target worlds and deploy Death Guard forces to establish military control, the Plague Marines fighting through whatever defenses the Imperium had positioned. Once the Death Guard controlled sufficient territory, the Daemon Primarch would personally manifest plagues across the world's surface, releasing diseases that spread through populations faster than any quarantine could contain. The supernatural nature of these plagues meant that conventional epidemiological responses proved ineffective, as the diseases operated according to warp-based principles rather than biological ones. Medical personnel who attempted to treat victims found themselves becoming infected despite protective equipment that should have been adequate, while quarantine protocols failed as the plague spread through mechanisms that ignored physical barriers. The Garden of Nurgle began manifesting across corrupted worlds as the diseases achieved sufficient saturation. These were regions where reality itself had been warped by concentrated chaos corruption, where the boundary between the material universe and Nurgle's realm in the warp had worn thin enough that aspects of the plague god's garden could bleed through. The gardens featured vegetation that appeared simultaneously alive and rotting, structures that seemed to be growing organically while also decaying, and populations of demons and corrupted mortals who existed in states between life and death. Imperial forces that entered these regions found themselves fighting in environments where the normal laws of physics applied inconsistently, where wounds that should have been survivable proved fatal, while injuries that should have killed instantly somehow failed to stop enemies who continued fighting despite catastrophic damage. Roboute Guilliman's return to the Imperium occurred during the early stages of the Plague Wars, the Primarch of the Ultramarines awakening from 10,000 years of stasis to find his realm under assault by forces led by his corrupted brother. Guilliman had been mortally wounded during the heresy and placed in stasis, his body preserved in a state between life and death, while the Imperium he had helped build continued without him. The circumstances of his revival involved the intervention of Eldar forces and the deployment of artifacts whose nature remained controversial within the Imperium, but the result was that one of the Emperor's loyal sons had returned to lead humanity's defense during its darkest hour since the heresy itself. The confrontation between Guilliman and Mortarion carried weight beyond simple military significance. These were brothers who had fought together during the Great Crusade, who had known each other before the heresy tore the Primarchs into opposing factions. Guilliman represented everything that Mortarion had rejected when he joined Horus's rebellion: loyalty to the Emperor despite philosophical disagreements, commitment to the Imperium's ideals even when its implementation fell short of those ideals, an acceptance of authority that derived from genetic engineering and the Emperor's will. The Lord Commander of the Imperium looked at Mortarion and saw a cautionary tale about what happened when Primarchs allowed their resentments to override their judgment, when they chose rebellion over attempting to reform the system from within. Mortarion saw in Guilliman a slave who had never recognized his chains, a being who possessed the power to challenge the Emperor's authority, but who instead chose to perpetuate a tyrannical system because he lacked the courage to imagine alternatives. The Daemon Primarch's corruption had not eliminated his ability to articulate his grievances or to justify his choices, even if those justifications rang hollow given what he had become. He argued that his damnation represented the price of resistance against tyranny, that his service to Nurgle was preferable to continued obedience to the Emperor, because at least he had chosen his current master rather than having that choice made for him by genetic programming. The fact that this choice had been made under duress, that Mortarion had accepted Nurgle's gifts to save his legion rather than out of genuine desire to serve the Plague God, was a complexity the Daemon Primarch acknowledged but did not consider invalidating to his broader argument. The battles between Guilliman's forces and the Death Guard occurred across dozens of worlds throughout Ultramar. The Lord Commander demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had made him legendary during the Great Crusade, coordinating defensive operations across multiple systems while simultaneously organizing counterattacks against Death Guard positions. Guilliman understood that defeating Mortarion required more than simply killing Plague Marines, as the Daemon Primarch could replace losses through recruitment and through summoning demonic reinforcements. The key was preventing the Death Guard from establishing the conditions necessary for their plagues to achieve full saturation, evacuating populations from threatened worlds before they could be infected, and implementing quarantine protocols that might slow supernatural diseases even if they could not stop them entirely. The Daemon Primarch responded to Guilliman's strategies with adaptations that demonstrated his own tactical expertise. Mortarion began deploying plagues that spread through mechanisms the Imperium could not easily counter, diseases that transmitted through warp-based vectors rather than through physical contact or airborne particles. These plagues could infect populations on worlds that had implemented perfect quarantine, spreading through psychic connections or through contamination of the warp itself in ways that made conventional epidemiological responses irrelevant. The Death Guard's campaigns became races between Guilliman's attempts to evacuate and protect populations and Mortarion's efforts to infect those populations before they could be moved to safety. The development and deployment of the Godblight represented Mortarion's most ambitious attempt to corrupt Ultramar beyond any possibility of Imperial recovery. This disease was not merely another plague, but a supernatural infection that Nurgle himself had crafted specifically for use against Guilliman and his realm. The Godblight attacked victims on every level simultaneously, destroying their bodies through physical disease while corrupting their souls and severing their connections to the Emperor's light. Space Marines infected with the Godblight found their gene seed corrupting, their enhanced organs failing in ways that their redundant biological systems could not compensate for, their faith in the Emperor eroding as the disease attacked the spiritual foundations of their identity as much as it attacked their physical forms. Mortarion deployed the Godblight during an assault on Ix, one of Ultramar's most important worlds, and the site where Guilliman had been raised after his gestation pod landed in the realm millennia ago. The symbolic significance of corrupting this particular world was not lost on either Primarch, as Ix represented the heart of everything Guilliman had built and everything the Ultramarines stood for. The Death Guard invaded in overwhelming strength, Mortarion leading his legion personally in assaults that pushed through Ultramarine defenses that had been prepared specifically to resist Chaos assault. The Daemon Primarch manifested the Godblight across Ix's surface once the Death Guard had established sufficient control, releasing a disease that began transforming the world into a reflection of Nurgle's garden. The final confrontation between Guilliman and Mortarion occurred in the ruins of Ix's capital city, where the two Primarchs met in single combat that would determine the Plague War's outcome. Guilliman wielded the Emperor's sword, a blade that had been crafted by the master of mankind himself, and which carried a fraction of his power. The weapon burned with flames that existed partially in the material universe and partially in the warp, capable of harming demon entities in ways that conventional weapons could not. The Lord Commander wore the armor of Fate, ancient artificer plate that provided protection beyond what normal Primarch equipment could offer, its systems enhanced through mechanisms that combined technology with faith-based reinforcement. Mortarion fought with silence, and with the full array of Demon Prince abilities, he had accumulated over 10,000 years of service to Nurgle. The Demon Primarch manifested plagues and miasmas around the combat zone, transforming the battlefield into an environment where Guilliman struggled to maintain his footing as the ground itself became infectious. The air grew thick with spores and pathogens that attacked the Lord Commander's armor seals, seeking any vulnerability through which they could reach the Primarch inside. Mortarion's physical strikes carried the weight of his massive, bloated form behind them, each blow from silence capable of carving through ceramite and bone with equal ease. The duel progressed with neither Primarch gaining decisive advantage initially. Guilliman's speed and precision allowed him to avoid many of Mortarion's strikes while landing hits with the Emperor's sword that burned the Demon Primarch's corrupted flesh. However, Mortarion's Demon Prince regeneration meant that even serious wounds healed within moments, his body reconstituting damage through supernatural processes that conventional injury could not overcome. The Lord Commander found himself in a war of attrition where his opponent could sustain damage indefinitely, while he had to avoid any serious injury, as his enhanced but still fundamentally mortal physiology lacked the regenerative capabilities that Demon Princes possessed. The turning point came when the Emperor's power manifested through Guilliman, directly rather than simply through the sword he wielded. The Lord Commander began radiating golden light that resembled the aura living saints displayed when the Emperor's power worked through them, his body becoming a conduit for divine energy that burned away the corruption Mortarion had spread across Ajax. The transformation was temporary rather than permanent, a moment when the Emperor reached through his son to strike directly at one of the traitor Primarchs who had betrayed him during the heresy. Guilliman's sword blazed with intensified power, its flames growing from mere fire into conflagration that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Mortarion experienced true pain for the first time since his transformation into a demon prince as the Emperor's power burned through him. The golden flames attacked not merely his physical form, but his essential nature, the warp-based essence that sustained his existence, and that made him effectively immortal. The Demon Primarch's body began disintegrating as the Emperor's light consumed the corruption that held it together, his flesh burning away to reveal the warp stuff underneath before that too began dissolving. The pain transcended anything physical, attacking Mortarion's soul directly and forcing him to confront the full weight of his damnation and everything he had sacrificed in service to Nurgle. The banishment occurred when Guilliman struck a final blow that severed Mortarion's connection to real space, the Emperor's sword cutting through the Demon Primarch's essence and forcing his retreat into the warp. Mortarion's physical form exploded into clouds of diseased vapor that dissipated as the Emperor's light burned away the corruption, his essence fleeing back to Nurgle's garden, where it would eventually reconstitute. The banishment was not permanent death, as demon princes could not be truly killed through conventional means, but it represented a decisive defeat that ended the Demon Primarch's ability to influence events in real space for the immediate future. The Death Guard forces on Ajax found themselves without their Primarch's leadership, and without the supernatural support his presence had provided. The Plague Marines continued fighting with their characteristic determination, but Guilliman's forces pressed their advantage with renewed vigor following Mortarion's banishment. The Ultramarines and their allies systematically reduced Death Guard positions across Ajax, killing Plague Marines and driving demon entities back into the warp through sustained combat that accepted no compromise. The world's corruption could not be fully reversed, as the Godblight had infected too much of Ajax's biosphere for complete purification to be feasible, but the immediate threat had been eliminated. The Plague Wars continued after Mortarion's banishment, but with significantly reduced intensity. The Death Guard lacked their Primarch's strategic direction and his ability to manifest plagues at the scale necessary to corrupt entire worlds rapidly. Guilliman organized systematic counterattacks that reclaimed worlds the Death Guard had conquered, implementing quarantine protocols and purification programs that contained the worst of the corruption, even when complete cleansing proved impossible. Ultramar would bear the scars of the Plague Wars for generations, dozens of worlds reduced to wastelands that could no longer support significant populations, but the realm had survived the greatest chaos assault it had faced since the heresy. Mortarion's essence reconstituted within Nurgle's garden over a period that corresponded to several years in real space, though time flowed inconsistently within the warp, and the actual duration was difficult to measure precisely. The Daemon Primarch emerged from his forced regeneration with full memory of his defeat and of the Emperor's power burning through him. The experience had not fundamentally changed his nature or his commitment to Nurgle's service, as demon princes lacked the capacity for genuine redemption once they had accepted full corruption. However, the defeat on Ajax represented a reminder that even demon primarchs remained vulnerable to sufficiently powerful opposition, that the Emperor retained the ability to strike at his corrupted sons when circumstances allowed his intervention. The Death Guard continue operating throughout the galaxy in the 42nd millennium, conducting raids and campaigns that spread Nurgle's corruption, even without Mortarion's direct leadership during his periods of banishment and regeneration. The Legion has become fragmented compared to its organization during the heresy, with individual warbands operating semi-independently under commanders who maintain varying degrees of loyalty to the Daemon Primarch. When Mortarion returns to real space after periods of forced regeneration, he works to coordinate these disparate forces into coherent campaigns, his strategic expertise and his Demon Prince powers making him one of Chaos's most effective commanders, despite his complicated relationship with the powers he serves. The Death Guard's organizational structure in the 41st and 42nd millennium bears little resemblance to the unified legion that fought during the Great Crusade and Heresy. 10,000 years of warfare within the Eye of Terror and across the galaxy have transformed what was once a coherent military force into a collection of semi-autonomous warbands that maintain varying degrees of connection to Mortarion's direct authority. The Legion's fragmentation reflects both practical necessity and the corrupting influence of chaos, as the Death Guard adapted to existence within a warp storm where conventional command structures proved difficult to maintain, and where individual commanders developed their own relationships with Nurgle's demonic servants. The 7 Plague Companies represent the Death Guard's primary organizational divisions, each commanded by a Lord of Contagion who holds authority comparable to what chapter masters wield in Loyalist Space Marine forces. These companies maintain closer ties to Mortarion than the numerous independent warbands, coordinating their operations with the Daemon Primarch's strategic objectives when he manifests in real space. The First Plague Company remains the most prestigious, traditionally commanded by whichever champion Mortarion currently favors most highly, though this position has changed hands multiple times over the millennia as commanders fall in battle or lose their Primarch's confidence. The companies vary significantly in size, some maintaining thousands of Plague Marines, while others have been reduced through attrition to a few hundred warriors, supplemented by cultist auxiliaries and demonic entities. Each Plague Company has developed its own tactical specializations and cultural characteristics during the long centuries of the Long War. The Second Plague Company focuses on ship-to-ship boarding actions and void warfare, their forces equipped with specialized weapons for fighting in the confined spaces of spacecraft corridors. The Third Company specializes in siege warfare that combines conventional military engineering with supernatural plague deployment, their commanders having studied the fortification techniques that Loyalist forces use and developed methods for corrupting defensive structures until they become liabilities rather than assets. The Fifth Plague Company has earned particular notoriety for their use of biological weapons that transform entire populations into plague zombies, creating armies of poxwalkers that overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers, while spreading disease to anyone they contact. Beyond the plague companies, hundreds of independent warbands operate throughout the galaxy under commanders who maintain only nominal allegiance to Mortarion. These forces range from small raiding parties of a few dozen plague marines to substantial armies that rival the plague companies in strength. Some warband leaders are former Death Guard who survived since the heresy, their bodies sustained through Nurgle's gifts for 10 millennia of continuous warfare. Others are more recent recruits, space marines from loyalist chapters who fell to corruption and joined the Death Guard, or warriors created from gene seed that the Legion has harvested from fallen enemies and corrupted for their own purposes. The warbands pursue their own objectives while spreading Nurgle's influence, attacking Imperial worlds and rival Chaos forces with equal enthusiasm depending on which targets present themselves. The relationship between Mortarion and Typhus represents one of the most significant fractures within the Death Guard's command structure. The former First Captain, now known as Typhus the Traveler and Herald of Nurgle, commands the fleet centered on his flagship Terminus Est and operates with near-complete independence from his Gene Father's authority. Typhus was instrumental in engineering Mortarion's corruption during the heresy, orchestrating the circumstances that forced the Primarch to accept Nurgle's gifts to save his legion. The betrayal created a permanent rift between them that neither has attempted to repair, as Mortarion understands that Typhus manipulated him into damnation, while Typhus views his actions as having been necessary to deliver the Death Guard to their proper destiny as Nurgle's chosen servants. Typhus pursues his own agenda throughout the galaxy, spreading plague and corruption according to his interpretation of Nurgle's will rather than following Mortarion's strategic direction. The Traveler has developed a reputation as one of Chaos's most effective champions, his campaigns achieving results that sometimes exceed what Mortarion's more methodical approach produces. Typhus specializes in rapid strikes that infect target worlds with virulent plagues before Imperial forces can organize effective responses, his fleets appearing from the warp to deploy diseases, and then withdrawing before Loyalist reinforcements arrive. The Herald of Nurgle has corrupted dozens of Space Marine chapters over the millennia, his diseases specifically designed to overcome Astartes' physiology and transform Loyalist warriors into plague marines who join his forces. The tension between Mortarion and Typhus occasionally erupts into open conflict when their objectives directly contradict each other, or when the Traveler's actions interfere with campaigns the Daemon Primarch is prosecuting. However, neither can eliminate the other permanently, as both are demon princes whose essences retreat into the warp when their physical forms are destroyed. Nurgle seems content to allow this rivalry to continue, the plague god's nature encompassing acceptance of conflict and competition among his servants. The practical result is that the Death Guard effectively operates under dual leadership, with some forces following Mortarion's direction while others serve Typhus, and both factions spreading Nurgle's corruption across the galaxy through different methodological approaches. The Death Guard's strategic objectives in the current era focus on spreading Nurgle's gifts throughout the Imperium while maintaining the long war against the Emperor's servants. The Legion does not seek to conquer territory in any conventional sense, as holding worlds against Imperial counterattacks would require resources and numbers the Death Guard lacks. Instead, they focus on transformation and corruption, using military force to establish initial footholds, and then deploying plagues that render worlds effectively worthless to the Imperium, even if Loyalist forces eventually reclaim them. A planet where the atmosphere carries supernatural diseases, where the water supplies host pathogens that resist all purification attempts, where the very soil teems with infections that attack anyone who walks upon it. Such a world might still appear on Imperial charts and fly Imperial flags, but it contributes nothing to the Imperium's strength and instead becomes a drain on resources as authorities attempt to contain the corruption. The corruption of Loyalist Space Marines represents a particularly valued objective for the Death Guard, as each Astartes who falls to Nurgle's service strengthens Chaos forces, while simultaneously weakening the Imperium's most elite warriors. the Legion deploys diseases specifically designed to overcome Space Marine physiology, plagues that attack gene seed and enhanced organs in ways that conventional infections cannot. Loyalist chapters that face the Death Guard in extended campaigns often suffer casualties, not merely from direct combat, but from supernatural infections that spread through their ranks despite all quarantine protocols. Warriors who survive initial exposure find themselves weakening over weeks or months as diseases progress through their enhanced bodies, their gene seed corrupting until they transform into plague marines who retain their combat skills and tactical knowledge while serving new masters. The Great Rift's opening has provided the Death Guard with unprecedented opportunities to strike at Imperial territory that was previously difficult to reach from their strongholds within the Eye of Terror. The massive warp storm created stable corridors through which Chaos forces can travel with far less difficulty than conventional warp transit requires, allowing the Legion to project power across the galaxy in ways that were impossible during the previous 10 millennia. Mortarion has exploited these opportunities through campaigns like the Plague Wars, marshalling Death Guard strength for major operations that achieve strategic objectives rather than merely conducting the raids and limited invasions that characterized most of their previous activities. The Death Guard maintains several fortress worlds within the Eye of Terror, and in regions where reality has worn thin enough for chaos corruption to manifest permanently. The Plague Planet serves as Mortarion's primary stronghold, a world that has been transformed into a reflection of Nurgle's garden, where diseases flourish and decay is celebrated. The planet's surface features structures that appear simultaneously under construction and falling apart, vegetation that seems alive while also rotting, and populations of plague marines and demons who exist in states between life and death. The Plague Planet functions as a staging ground for major campaigns and as a laboratory where new diseases are developed and tested before deployment against Imperial targets. Other Death Guard fortress worlds serve specialized purposes within the Legion's overall strategy. Some function as recruitment centers where aspirants are transformed into plague marines through processes that combine conventional Space Marine creation with exposure to Nurgle's corruption. Others serve as shipyards where the Death Guard's fleets are maintained and expanded, their facilities producing vessels that incorporate both standard Imperial technology and demonic enhancements. The fortress worlds are connected through warp routes that allow relatively reliable travel, despite the instability that characterizes most warp transit within chaos-controlled regions, creating a network of strongholds from which the Death Guard can launch operations throughout the galaxy. The Legion's relationship with other traitor legions and chaos forces varies based on circumstances and individual commanders' preferences. The Death Guard sometimes cooperates with other Chaos Space Marines when objectives align, participating in Black Crusades and major invasions, where multiple traitor legions coordinate their efforts. However, these alliances remain temporary and pragmatic, rather than reflecting any genuine unity among Chaos forces. The Death Guard has fought against other traitor legions as often as they have fought alongside them, conflicts erupting over resources, territory within the Eye of Terror, or simply because Chaos champions sought to prove their superiority through combat. Nurgle's servants maintain particularly contentious relationships with forces dedicated to Khorne, as the Blood God's emphasis on direct violence and honorable combat conflicts fundamentally with Nurgle's preference for slow corruption and patient decay. The Plague Marines who form the Death Guard's core strength have become something far removed from the Space Marines they once were. Their bodies have fused with their armor through 10,000 years of corruption, ceramite and diseased flesh merging into hybrid forms, where the boundaries between equipment and biology have become meaningless. Most Plague Marines no longer remove their armor, as doing so would require separating material that has become integral to their physical structure. Their enhanced organs continue functioning despite appearing corrupted beyond any possibility of survival, hearts pumping fluids that resemble pus more than blood, lungs processing atmospheres that would kill unprotected humans instantly, digestive systems breaking down materials that should be toxic into nutrients their bodies can utilize. The Plague Marines' resilience exceeds what they possessed as conventional Death Guard Space Marines during the Heresy. Wounds that would incapacitate normal Astartes barely slow them, their corrupted bodies continuing to function despite damage that should be catastrophic. Bolter rounds that punch through their armor and detonate inside their bodies cause injuries that the Plague Marines ignore, continuing to fight with portions of their internal organs destroyed or missing. Their pain receptors have been altered through Nurgle's gifts, transforming agony into something they perceive as merely sensation, rather than as motivation to avoid further injury. This combination of physical resilience and altered pain perception makes Plague Marines extraordinarily difficult to stop through conventional combat, as they simply do not respond to damage the way normal warriors do. The Death Guard's equipment reflects 10,000 years of use and corruption, weapons and vehicles that should have failed long ago, continuing to function through combinations of maintenance and demonic influence. Bolters carried by Plague Marines appear corroded and damaged, their mechanisms clogged with growths that should prevent them from firing, yet the weapons discharge reliably when their wielders pull the triggers. Vehicles show similar characteristics, their armor pitted and holed, their engines leaking fluids and emitting noxious fumes, their systems operating despite appearing to be in states of catastrophic failure. The Death Guard maintains this equipment through methods that combine conventional technical knowledge with rituals that invoke Nurgle's favor, their warpsmiths and plague surgeons working to keep weapons and vehicles functional, while allowing the corruption to spread in ways that enhance rather than impair performance. Mortarion's enduring philosophy represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of his current existence. The Daemon Primarch began his life fighting against tyrants who had elevated themselves above humanity through sorcery and unnatural means, who used their powers to oppress ordinary humans who lacked any ability to resist. He built his identity around principles of self-reliance and earned strength, believing that true power came from enduring hardship through one's own capabilities, rather than through gifts or advantages granted by others. The Death Guard under his command embodied these principles, warriors who achieved extraordinary resilience through systematic conditioning and training, rather than through supernatural enhancement. His transformation into a demon prince of Nurgle destroyed everything these principles represented. Mortarion became exactly what he had fought against on Barbarous, a being elevated far above humanity through powers he did not earn and cannot fully control, wielding supernatural abilities that create an unbridgeable gap between himself and the mortals he claims to serve. His immortality comes not from his own strength, but from Nurgle's gifts, his powers derive from a chaos god, whose nature embodies everything he once despised about the overlords of his homeworld. The Daemon Primarch spreads corruption and disease across the galaxy, enslaving worlds through supernatural pestilence in ways that mirror how the overlords of Barbarous terrorized the human populations in their valleys. The awareness of this contradiction has not left Mortarion despite his corruption. Unlike some demon princes who embrace their transformation and genuinely worship the chaos gods they serve, the former master of the Death Guard retains enough of his original personality to understand what he has become. He serves Nurgle because he is bound to do so through the transformation that saved his legion during their voyage to Terra, because refusing would mean ceasing to exist in any meaningful form. The bitterness that characterized his initial acceptance of the Plague God's gifts has never fully dissipated, manifesting as an undercurrent of rage that colors all his actions, and that occasionally erupts in violence directed at anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby, when his self-awareness becomes too acute to suppress. This makes Mortarion one of the most psychologically complex of the Daemon Primarchs, a being who fully embraces his role as Nurgle's champion, while simultaneously hating what that role represents and what it has cost him. He prosecutes campaigns with absolute commitment, spreading plague and corruption with an effectiveness that makes him one of Chaos's most valuable servants. Yet he does so without the joy or satisfaction that some Chaos champions display, without genuine belief in Nurgle's vision or faith in the Plague God's ultimate triumph. Mortarion fights because fighting is what he was created to do, because 10,000 years of warfare have left him with no other purpose, and because the alternative to serving Nurgle would be non-existence. The Death Guard's legacy in the 41st and 42nd millennium is written in the corrupted worlds they leave behind, in the populations transformed into plague zombies or worse, in the Space Marine chapters that have fallen to Nurgle's corruption after facing the 14th Legion in battle. They represent one of the Imperium's most persistent threats, a traitor legion that cannot be permanently defeated because their Daemon Primarch and many of their champions simply retreat into the warp when killed and eventually return to continue their campaigns. The Death Guard will endure as long as Nurgle exists, as long as disease and decay remain fundamental aspects of existence, spreading corruption across the galaxy in service to a god whose gifts they accepted not out of devotion, but out of desperate necessity during humanity's greatest civil war. Mortarion leads them still, a pale king who once fought to free his world from tyrants, and who now enslaves entire systems through supernatural plague, forever bound to the very forces he spent his mortal life opposing, a living monument to how even the noblest intentions can be corrupted when pride and resentment are given room to fester.